In the early hours before sunrise, when the world still clung to the last threads of night, a strange stillness hung over Paris. The city was unaware that history was about to convulse. Torches flickered like restless spirits along narrow streets as King Philip's soldiers fanned out with secret orders sealed in wax. The cold October wind carried a sense of something unnatural, like the air itself sensed betrayal. Across France, the same scene repeated again and again. Armored men marching with quiet urgency toward commanderies that had stood peacefully for centuries. Inside those stone walls, the Knights Templar, disciplined, confident, accustomed to a life of order, were beginning their morning prayers. They could not have imagined that these footsteps in the dark were coming for them. At dawn's first pale light, the doors burst open. Steel clashed, parchment flew, sacred objects toppled. The knights were dragged from their beds, from their chapels, from their daily routines that had not changed in generations. Some resisted out of instinct. Most froze in disbelief. The charges shouted at them. Heresy, sacrilege, devil worship were so bizarre, so grotesque, that the men could not fathom whether this was a nightmare or a real betrayal. In some commanderies, smoke began to rise as soldiers seized documents and threw them onto hastily built pyres. Maps, scrolls, coded letters, treatises copied by candlelight over decades, all curling into ash within minutes. The smell of burning vellum drifted across courtyards like the funeral incense of knowledge itself. But not everywhere. At La Rochelle, the Templar stronghold on the western shore of France, there was no surprise. Rumors had reached them late in the night, a whisper carried by a frightened messenger who had fled a nearby arrest. The Templar commanders acted immediately. Bells rang, but not for prayer. Brothers scrambled through the stone corridors, gathering sealed chests, bound scroll tubes, geometric instruments, crates of something heavy enough to require 4 men to lift. Orders were sharp, rapid, without explanation. Everything of importance was to be moved to the harbor. The port of La Rochelle was shrouded in a thick pre-dawn fog, the kind of mist that bends sound and hides intentions. There, at anchor, waited the Templar fleet, sleek, surprisingly fast ships built not for war but for distance. Their sails were furled, their decks quiet, as if holding their breath. One by one, the chests arrived. Some men seemed to know exactly what they were handling, while others refused even to touch the containers. They worked with a solemnity that suggested these objects carried a weight far greater than gold. Some boxes emitted a dull metallic ring when shifted. Others made muffled cracks, like stone meeting stone. A few bore strange markings. Spiral symbols, geometric crosses, fragments of languages no one present could read. As the last crates were loaded, the Templar commander at the harbor received word that royal soldiers were less than an hour away. He looked over the fleet ships that had been prepared for years, maintained in perfect readiness. This was not panic. This was a plan long waiting for its signal. Throughout Europe, the Templars were falling, but here on the Atlantic coast, the order was slipping quietly through the cracks of history. The anchors were raised. Sails unfurled and billowed as the morning wind caught them. The fog swallowed the ships almost immediately, turning them into dim shadows that drifted toward the open sea. On the cliffs above the port, a handful of brothers remained behind, watching the fleet disappear into the whiteness. They would face arrest, imprisonment, and torture, but they stayed willingly. Delay was their final duty. As the distant silhouettes dissolved fully into the mist, one of the older knights whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for what the fleet carried. Something he believed must never fall into the hands of kings or popes. Something older than the order itself. Back in Paris, King Philip celebrated victory. He believed he had struck with perfect timing, seizing the order before they could hide their wealth. Yet when his agents reached La Rochelle, they found only empty docks and lingering fog. Not a single Templar ship remained. Not a single chest. Not a single clue. Word spread quietly. The fleet had vanished. Some said it split in 2 directions, others that it sailed west toward unknown waters. A few whispered that the ships were headed toward islands only spoken of in secret Templar circles. But one rumor chilled even the most hardened chroniclers. that among the cargo was something far more dangerous than wealth. Something that could rewrite the origins of kingdoms, religions, and civilizations. In the years that followed, strange testimonies emerged. Fishermen swore they saw heavily laden ships passing at dawn, heading into the open Atlantic. A monk described a group of Templars landing secretly at a northern harbor with crates they refused to open. A sailor insisted he saw unfamiliar sails near the Azores, marked with a faded red cross that vanished when he tried to approach. The truth remained elusive, trapped somewhere between history and myth. But one thing was certain. The Templars did not scatter in panic. They moved with purpose, precision, and a conviction that their mission was far from over. Whatever they carried onto those ships had been protected for centuries. And as Europe descended into persecution and chaos, that knowledge, whatever it was, sailed quietly into the unknown, waiting for the world to be ready. The arrests marked the fall of the Templar Order. But that morning at La Rochelle felt like the beginning of something far older, slipping away into the mist before the rest of history could catch up. A strange calm had settled over the coastline in the days after the Templar arrests, as though the sea itself were keeping a secret. Fishermen along the Bay of Biscay whispered among themselves, unsure whether to speak of what they had seen before dawn on the fateful morning when the knights vanished. Some described silhouettes of ships slipping silently toward the horizon. Others swore they heard the muffled clatter of heavy cargo being loaded in the dark. None of them could explain why the Templars, usually so visible and orderly, moved like ghosts that day. Yet scattered along the coastlines of France and northern Spain, rumors persisted about the mysterious cargo carried aboard the final fleet. Legends claimed that the chests taken to the ships were not filled with gold or coin, as Philip's agents suspected, but with something far stranger. Certain fishermen recalled glimpsing crates reinforced with dark iron bands, engraved with symbols that did not resemble letters so much as spirals, stars, and interlocking geometric patterns. One elderly dockworker later recalled how two knights struggled to lift a long stone object wrapped in cloth, swearing under their breath as though the thing inside was more fragile than valuable. The memory haunted him for the rest of his life. Officially, nothing survived. The documents seized in the raids made no mention of strange artifacts. The interrogations, carried out with pain designed to extract confessions, never produced a single admission of exotic cargo. But the silence itself only deepened suspicion. If the knights had been forced to surrender everything, why were so many pages missing from their inventories? Why had certain storehouses been emptied the night before the arrests? Why did surviving Templars in Portugal and Scotland speak of burdens taken to the waters, but refuse to elaborate? Years later, long after the order fell, a group of French divers exploring the shallows near La Rochelle reported finding something unusual. Fragments of carved stone lying on the seabed, partially buried in the silt. At first, the pieces appeared natural, but as they brushed away the accumulated layers, faint markings emerged. Straight lines intersecting at precise angles that looked deliberate rather than accidental. The divers retrieved a handful of these fragments, heavy and cold even after hours in the sun. Specialists examined them but could not determine their origin. They resembled no known medieval carving style, nor did they match the weathering typical of local stone. Most scholars dismissed the discovery as misidentification or coincidence. Still, the divers refused to let the matter go. The carved lines were too clean, too purposeful, and arranged in patterns that seemed to echo a kind of geometry not taught in medieval Europe. Some researchers pointed out that the symbols faintly resembled diagrams associated with ancient astronomical observations, patterns meant to map not earthly geography but the heavens. As more diverse ventured out over the years, they claimed to find additional fragments, each more unusual than the last. Pieces of stone that appeared to be part of a larger structure, broken edges that connected like a puzzle, and strange discolorations that looked almost like scorch marks. One fragment even contained a shallow, circular depression, perfectly smooth, as though something once rested there. Whatever it had been, it was no ordinary piece of medieval masonry. None of the pieces were large enough to reconstruct anything meaningful, but the implication was troubling. Something had been in the water near La Rochelle, something human-made, long before modern divers discovered it. Yet the mystery did not end with these underwater fragments. Centuries-old local tales spoke of forbidden cargo loaded onto the Templar ships during the last hours before the arrests. One story, passed down through a family of dockworkers, described a group of knights carrying a pair of stone tablets wrapped in waxed linen. According to the tale, the knights warned that the objects must never touch the ground. Another legend told of a sealed chest that emanated a faint, humming vibration when lifted, causing one frightened laborer to drop his end and flee the port entirely. Were these stories the result of embellishment over generations? Perhaps, but their consistency across different regions suggested a kernel of truth. People who had no reason to collaborate, those from fishing villages, merchant families, and harbor communities separated by miles, repeated similar details. Stone objects, star-marked containers, sealed scroll tubes, and chests that the knights handled with an almost sacred reverence. The deeper question was not what these objects were, but why the Templars risked everything to preserve them. Some theorized that the items were relics from the Holy Land, scrolls hidden beneath the Temple Mount, ancient records from pre-biblical civilizations, or maps copied from sources older than the pyramids. Others believed the cargo was scientific in nature, astronomical charts, navigational instruments, or records of older continents lost to time. There were even those who whispered that the objects were warnings from an earlier age, messages carved in stone by a civilization wiped out by a great catastrophe. The intrigue intensified when historians studying Templar documents noticed a strange pattern. Several of the order's most experienced mariners were stationed at La Rochelle in the months leading to the arrests. Normally, these men were spread across various Templar ports for logistical efficiency. Their sudden concentration at a single harbor suggested preparation, coordination, and intent. Someone within the order had known that danger was coming. Even more unsettling were the notes left behind by a chronicler from the region, who wrote of men who carried knowledge not meant for kings, and cargo that belonged to neither France nor Christendom but to the deep past. His writings were vague, as though he feared the consequences of clarity, but they revealed one thing. People in the region believed the Templars were hiding something that predated their order by centuries. As time passed, the stories grew bolder. Some claimed that the final fleet carried an archive of forbidden texts. Others believed the Templars had discovered evidence of a lost civilization, something that could undermine the foundations of the medieval worldview. Still others suspected that the knights were fleeing not just with artifacts, but with coordinates, directions to a place known only within the highest ranks of the order. Whatever the truth, the sea swallowed the evidence. All that remained were scattered fragments, whispered legends, and the inexplicable silence of the Templar fleet as it sailed into the fog. Whatever those ships carried, stone tablets, ancient scrolls, or relics from a forgotten age, they disappeared beneath the horizon, leaving behind questions that would echo for centuries. Long before the rise of the Knights Templar, before stone cathedrals reached toward the heavens or medieval scholars debated the shape of the world, humanity had already lived through ages of brilliance, darkness, and rediscovery. Across deserts, mountains, jungles, and coastlines, scattered traces of forgotten civilizations whisper of a time when humanity's earliest architects built with a precision that defies modern explanation. Their cities were aligned with the stars, their temples tuned to solstices, their monuments anchored to cardinal points with uncanny accuracy. To walk among their ruins is to feel a presence, an intelligence, that seems older than any of the cultures we typically call ancient. It begins with a puzzle. Why do civilizations separated by continents and oceans share the same obsessions? Spiral motifs, sun disks, star maps, 9-step pyramids, flood myths, and stories of a first age destroyed by water or fire. Different names, different languages, but the same underlying narrative. Something great existed, something collapsed, and something survived through memory, myth, and symbol. Archaeologists explain some of these similarities through convergent development, but others remain stubbornly resistant to simple answers. For instance, the alignment of the pyramids in Egypt with Orion's belt is mirrored by the layout of monuments in Teotihuacan, separated by thousands of miles and vast stretches of ocean. Megalithic sites from Malta to Indonesia incorporate the same angular cuts of stone, as though their builders inherited techniques rather than invented them. Then there are the legends. In South America, the Inca spoke of Viracocha, a mysterious teacher who arrived after a great flood, bringing knowledge of building, writing, and astronomy. In the Middle East, the Sumerians told of Apkallu, sage beings sent to restore civilization after a catastrophic deluge. In India, ancient texts describe previous ages of humankind destroyed by cosmic forces, with survivors tasked to carry forward the remnants of lost wisdom. In Egypt, priests recorded a lineage of followers of Horus, who preceded the pharaohs by thousands of years, living through an age of upheaval long before the Nile kingdom rose. Different cultures, different time periods, but the same core idea. Civilization didn't begin from nothing. Something came before. Something grand. Something that almost vanished. When the Greek philosopher Solon visited Egypt centuries before Plato, he was told by the priests of Sais that humanity had been destroyed and reborn many times, and that the Greeks knew only one cycle of history, one fragment of a much larger story. The priests spoke of older records, thousands of years older, describing a sophisticated world that perished in a night of earthquakes and rising seas. Solon carried this tale back to Greece, where it eventually became the foundation of Plato's story of Atlantis. But to the Egyptian priests, this wasn't myth. It was memory. If echoes like these appear across the world, then it raises an unsettling possibility. Perhaps remnants of an earlier global culture, one wiped out by cataclysm, survived just long enough to seed the early civilizations we know today. This idea, controversial as it is, offers a way to understand the shared architectural instincts, astronomical precision, and flood traditions that occur everywhere. It also suggests that the most ancient societies we admire, Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, may not have been the beginning but instead the inheritors of forgotten knowledge. And if such knowledge existed, what became of it? Some believe it was recorded in stone, encoded in geometry, or embedded in myth. Others argue that a small group of survivors carried fragments of this wisdom with them as they spread across the world, rebuilding where they could. Over thousands of years, these fragments may have formed the core teachings of mystery schools, priestly castes, and later esoteric societies. It is this thread, the possibility of a deep-time lineage of knowledge, that would eventually fascinate thinkers in the medieval world, including the Knights Templar. While the average soldier of the order focused on battles, vows, and the hardships of daily life, certain members, especially those connected to the Templar leadership, seemed increasingly drawn to ancient texts, sacred geometries, and the symbolic language of the ancients. Their time in the Holy Land exposed them to ruins far older than Judaism or Christianity, ruins that hinted at even earlier ages. They walked among structures whose builders were unknown, and they listened to local traditions that spoke of civilizations lost long before biblical time. One of the most intriguing examples of ancient architectural brilliance comes from Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, a site over 11,000 years old, predating writing, agriculture, and metalwork. Massive stone pillars arranged in perfect circles bear carvings of animals and symbols that suggest astronomical meaning. Whoever built Göbekli Tepe possessed organizational skill and scientific understanding that should not have existed in the Stone Age. Either the timeline of human progress is wrong, or these builders inherited knowledge from an earlier source. Other sites push the mystery deeper. The megalithic blocks of Sacsayhuaman in Peru fit together so precisely that not even a blade of grass can be inserted between them. The Yonaguni structures in Japan, submerged below the sea, show massive terraces and straight-line cuts that resemble urban foundations. The Bimini Road in the Bahamas, discovered in the 1960s, lies exactly where Edgar Cayce, a controversial figure, but startlingly specific, predicted ruins of a sunken culture would be found. Taken separately, these sites are fascinating anomalies. Seen collectively, they form the outline of a story much older than recorded history. Within this framework, Atlantis stops looking like a simple myth and begins to resemble a memory. Distorted, fragmented, and surrounded by legend, yes, but anchored in something real. Not a single city swallowed in a single night, but the symbolic name for a sophisticated culture destroyed during a global cataclysm at the end of the last ice age. a culture whose remnants influenced early human rebuilding efforts, a culture whose knowledge may have been partially preserved. Fast forward thousands of years. When the Templar Knights traveled across Europe and the Middle East, they encountered echoes of this ancient world in temples, inscriptions, and hidden tunnels beneath Jerusalem. They studied geometry, astronomy, and architectural principles not found in medieval Christian teachings. Some chroniclers even claimed that the Templars possessed maps older than any kingdom in Europe, maps hinting at coastlines altered by rising seas. If true, then the Templars may not have been the first to seek out the lost knowledge of humanity's earliest builders. They were simply the next in a long chain of seekers, inheritors of whispers echoing across time. And if those whispers led them toward hidden truths preserved in stone or scroll, it could explain why they guarded their discoveries so fiercely, and why their enemies feared what they might have found. Plato's account of Atlantis did not enter the world as a legend, nor as a fireside tale passed from traveler to traveler. It was introduced with the precision of a philosopher, the seriousness of a historian, and the caution of a man who understood that certain truths can be too dangerous to speak plainly. When he set the story down in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he framed it not as invention, but as a recollection, a memory passed to Solon by Egyptian priests, and then carried through generations until it reached him. This alone makes the Atlantis narrative different from other myths. Plato insisted it was a historical record disguised within a philosophical conversation. The strangeness begins with his attention to numbers. Plato gave measurements, dates, land sizes, harbor shapes, and even the specific configuration of concentric rings carved into the island's capital city. He described its canal systems, its agricultural layout, the width of its walls, and the exact ratio of land to water. These are not the details a storyteller reaches for when inventing fiction. They are the details of a scholar trying to preserve information. And yet, Plato was careful, almost too careful, to cloak the account in metaphor, placing it within a dialogue where larger philosophical themes provided plausible deniability. The Egyptian priests who told Solon the tale had chastised him. "You Greeks are like children. You remember one flood, one destruction, but there were many." In their view, humanity had risen and fallen repeatedly, knowledge wiped out and painfully rebuilt. They spoke of records older than the Greek alphabet, preserved by those who had survived the last great catastrophe. And it was from these records, they claimed, that the story of Atlantis came. To the Egyptians, it was not legend, it was memory. Plato's description of the disaster that destroyed Atlantis is equally unsettling. He speaks of a single terrible day and night of fire and earthquakes, after which the entire island sank beneath the sea and vanished. Modern historians often dismiss this as mythic exaggeration, but geological evidence shows that ancient civilizations did experience sudden cataclysms, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and meteor impacts capable of reshaping entire coastlines overnight. Natural disasters of this scale have occurred, and would have appeared divine to ancient people. But the true intrigue lies in what Plato does not say. The dialogues where he described Atlantis were never finished. The last lines of Critias break off mid-sentence, cutting the account short without explanation. Scholars have debated for centuries whether Plato simply abandoned the story due to age or illness, or whether he feared the consequences of revealing too much. Some argue he sensed that the truth behind the tale, whatever its origin, was not something his world was prepared to confront. Others believe that Plato himself did not fully understand what he had inherited, that he wrestled with the limits of his own knowledge as he composed the dialogues. Yet even incomplete, his words carry the weight of something older than philosophy. They hint at technologies and infrastructures far beyond the capabilities of Bronze Age civilizations. The canals he described would have required advanced hydraulic engineering. The temples and palaces of Atlantis were said to be adorned with metals rare and revered, including a mysterious alloy called orichalcum. Even Atlantis's military strength, depicted as enormous and well-organized, suggests a level of coordination and sophistication that does not correlate with the known cultures of Plato's era. Some scholars have proposed that Plato's account was simply an allegory, a moral tale illustrating the dangers of hubris. While possible, the level of detail undermines this interpretation. Allegories seldom require blueprints, city plans, or precise measurements. Plato was capable of philosophical abstraction without resorting to geographic and architectural specifics. The fact that he included them implies a different intention, to immortalize fragments of something he believed genuinely existed. The Egyptian priests who shared the story with Solon also provided a timeline. The destruction of Atlantis occurred 9,000 years before Solon's visit. To the Greeks, this number would have seemed impossibly ancient, older than their own conception of history. But modern discoveries complicate the dismissal of such an age. Sites like Göbekli Tepe demonstrate that human societies with sophisticated architectural knowledge existed around 10,000 BCE. The timeline once considered unthinkable now aligns eerily with Plato's estimate. Another perplexing detail is Plato's reference to the Pillars of Heracles, generally believed to refer to the Strait of Gibraltar. According to the dialogues, Atlantis lay beyond this boundary in the true ocean, what we now know as the Atlantic. For centuries, explorers and mystics focused their searches westward. The Azores, Madeira, the Caribbean, and the Bahamas. These regions hold underwater anomalies that resemble sunken structures, though none are conclusively proven to be human-made. Still, the alignment between Plato's geographical hint and locations where submerged ruins have been found is striking. And yet, perhaps the greatest mystery is the tone of Plato's writing. When he describes Atlantis, his words shift from philosophical argument to something more reverent, almost mournful. It is as if he is writing about a lost homeland, not one he belonged to personally, but one he sensed humanity had once known. His admiration for the Atlanteans is tempered by warning. He portrays them as a people who fell into arrogance and moral decay, prompting the gods to wipe them from the earth. But even in their downfall, there is the lingering impression that they possessed knowledge the world had not yet regained. Some researchers believe that Plato intentionally layered his account with both truth and disguise, preserving a deeper narrative for those capable of reading between the lines. His specificity acted as a trail of breadcrumbs, guiding future seekers toward a forgotten chapter of human history. His omissions, abrupt ending, and philosophical framing offered protection, ensuring that powerful or controversial ideas would not provoke backlash in his own time. If Plato was encoding something, the question becomes, who was meant to decode it? Renaissance scholars certainly tried. Enlightenment thinkers continued the search. And in the medieval world, there were groups, quiet, disciplined, insatiably curious, who might have recognized Plato's hints for what they were. The Knights Templar, during their Crusader years, gained access to texts and traditions preserved by Eastern scholars, many of whom possessed interpretations of Plato very different from the simplified versions taught in Europe. It is entirely possible that the Templars saw Plato not merely as a philosopher but as a custodian of ancient knowledge, someone who had preserved the memory of a forgotten world. This connection raises a provocative possibility. Perhaps Plato's strange, meticulous, tantalizingly incomplete account was not meant to end with him. Perhaps it was part of a much larger chain of transmission. A chain leading through Egypt, through Greece, through the medieval orders that dug beneath Jerusalem, and ultimately toward those who vanished with the Templar fleet. Plato's warning may not have been philosophical at all. It may have been historical. And if so, the Templars may have seized upon it with a determination that would set them on a collision course with kings, popes, and the very fabric of accepted history. When considering the mysterious disappearance of the Knights Templar, one must look beyond the political betrayals and financial motivations that are usually offered as explanations. Their downfall was too sudden, too coordinated, and too absolute to be the product of ordinary circumstances. There is a lingering sense that the pressure against them was not simply because of their wealth or influence, but because they possessed something that threatened the balance of power in medieval Europe. The Templars had access to knowledge gathered during their long stay in the Holy Land, and their interactions with Eastern scholars opened doors to ancient traditions the West had largely forgotten. Their archives were rumored to contain writings, maps, and artifacts that predated Christianity, items so unusual that kings and clergy grew uneasy with what the order might reveal. As the Templars excavated beneath the Temple Mount, they were not merely searching for treasures in the material sense. They sought records, symbols, and evidence of civilizations whose memory lingered only in fragments. Some accounts suggest they uncovered scrolls that referenced ancient cataclysms and lost cultures, documents that bore a striking resemblance to the forgotten histories whispered by Egyptian priests in Plato's dialogues. These discoveries, if they truly existed, would have challenged the authority of both church and monarchy. Knowledge that humanity had risen and fallen long before the biblical timeline could unravel the theological foundations upon which European society was built. If the Templars understood this, they would have known their position in the world depended not on their armies, but on the secrets they guarded. The fear surrounding the order grew as stories circulated about their rituals, their coded symbols, and their private teachings. To their enemies, secrecy itself became proof of wrongdoing, and whispers quickly turned into accusations. Yet many historians believe these accusations were exaggerations or deliberate fabrications. A more plausible explanation is that the Templars used hidden symbolism to protect information that could not be openly discussed. Their encrypted documents, geometric emblems, and layered myths were not signs of heresy, but tools of preservation. Such techniques allowed them to pass forbidden knowledge in ways that would not attract immediate suspicion, while still keeping it safe from the uninitiated. When the arrests began, the speed with which the Templars responded suggests they expected some form of betrayal, though perhaps not the scale of the assault that followed. Many of their highest-ranking members vanished before they could be seized, and their treasures, whatever form they took, were nowhere to be found. The famous fleet that disappeared from the port of La Rochelle remains one of the most enduring mysteries of medieval history. Ships do not simply vanish without trace, and the Templars were meticulous record-keepers. It appears almost certain that they planned an escape route long before their enemies closed in on them. Whether they sailed westward toward uncharted waters or traveled north to regions where sympathetic allies lived, the movement was deliberate and coordinated. The most unsettling question is what exactly they carried with them as they fled. If their treasure consisted only of gold, kings would not have reacted with such urgency. It was the possibility of hidden writings, ancient maps, or artifacts that fueled the fury of those who sought to destroy them. Even after the order's dissolution, European monarchs remained restless, as though afraid that the surviving Templars might one day return with revelations capable of destabilizing their thrones. The Church, too, seemed troubled by the idea that certain truths might emerge that would force a rewriting of its sacred chronology. Some researchers argue that the Templars were not merely protectors of relics but curators of a secret lineage of knowledge stretching back to prehistoric times. Their understanding of geometry, navigation, architecture, and symbolism appeared abruptly advanced, hinting that they were drawing from sources much older than their own era. If the writings they recovered beneath Jerusalem traced back to ancient catastrophes or forgotten civilizations, then the Templars might have viewed themselves as guardians of humanity's buried past. Their silence, then, would not have been driven by fear, but by responsibility. The disappearance of the order did not mark the end of their influence. Many of the symbols attributed to them began appearing in unexpected places, in guilds, in maritime traditions, in architectural layouts, and in the secretive societies that emerged in the centuries following their collapse. These groups carried a similar fascination with ancient wisdom, encoded maps, and metaphysical teachings. It is as though the Templars dissolved publicly but continued privately in new forms, scattering fragments of their knowledge across Europe while keeping the most dangerous secrets hidden within a smaller and more disciplined circle. The true weight of their legacy lies not in the battles they fought or the fortresses they built, but in the persistent suspicion that they possessed insight into a chapter of human history now lost to time. If they had indeed uncovered records that aligned with Plato's account of Atlantis or other forgotten civilizations, their escape becomes far more than a flight from persecution. It becomes a migration of memory, a deliberate effort to protect truths that could not safely exist within the political and religious climate of medieval Europe. What they carried away remains unknown, yet the silence left in their wake feels intentional, as though they had sworn an oath to protect ideas not meant for the world they were leaving behind. Their disappearance becomes less a vanishing act and more a veil drawn over a knowledge too powerful to be exposed, a knowledge that may yet resurface when the world is finally prepared to hear it. In the centuries that followed the Templars' disappearance, scattered clues began to surface, hints that their flight was not random, nor driven solely by fear, but part of a much older pattern woven into the Order's earliest foundations. It is tempting to imagine the Templars as warriors first and seekers second, but the deeper one looks into their origins, the more their story appears to revolve around something other than battlefields. The men who would one day sail under the Red Cross were shaped in the shadow of legends whispered across Europe, stories of ancient islands swallowed by the sea, civilizations destroyed by forces beyond understanding, and archives of lost knowledge waiting to be discovered by those bold enough to pursue them. These tales were not regarded as mere myths, but as fragments of a forgotten truth that certain scholars, monks, and mystics claimed had been suppressed or distorted. Long before the Templars set foot in Jerusalem, Europe's monastic communities preserved texts that mentioned distant lands destroyed in a single night, cataclysms that reshaped the world, and migrations of survivors who carried their knowledge into new regions. These accounts, often dismissed by the Church as allegories or pagan fables, nevertheless fascinated a small but persistent circle of thinkers. Some believed these stories pointed to a real event, a memory preserved in every culture, from Egypt to Greece to the Celtic North. Among these early seekers were the men who would eventually form the backbone of the Templar Order. Many came from noble families whose libraries held rare manuscripts, maps copied from Greek originals, and encoded commentaries hinting that the world as they knew it was only a remnant of something far older. When the first 9 knights traveled east and carved out a base beneath the ruins of the temple, they were stepping into a space haunted by layers of history. Jewish, Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic traditions all claimed that the ground held secrets stretching back beyond recorded time. Some chroniclers suspected that these early Templars had already been indoctrinated into a mystery tradition that viewed Jerusalem not only as a holy city, but as the crossroads of ancient migrations. If survivors of past cataclysms had indeed fled toward the Levant, as certain legends suggested, then the Templars might have believed that remnants of those civilizations were preserved somewhere within the region, whether buried in archives, hidden within symbolic designs, or encoded in sacred stories. This possibility sheds new light on why the Order devoted so much effort to excavation rather than purely military endeavors during its early years. Their mission may not have been primarily to protect pilgrims, but to recover and preserve fragments of a knowledge system that had once stretched across continents. Their interest in geometric architecture, astronomical alignments, and sacred measurements did not appear suddenly. It was inherited from traditions that regarded such knowledge as the key to understanding both the heavens and the earth. Every time the Templars built a commandery or a cathedral-inspired structure, they incorporated symbols and proportions far older than medieval Christianity, as though they were reconstructing something from memory. As their influence grew, so too did their exposure to other cultures that held pieces of humanity's forgotten past. From Muslim scholars, they learned advanced mathematics and star lore. From Jewish mystics, they absorbed ideas about hidden histories, cycles of destruction, and the possibility of civilizations erased by divine or natural forces. From the Byzantine world, they encountered legends of sunken kingdoms and temples swallowed by the sea. These fragments did not form a complete picture, but they resonated with the stories that had shaped the early ethos of the Order. The more the Templars learned, the more convinced they became that the world's oldest secrets had been scattered deliberately, waiting for those with the discipline and courage to gather them. This widening worldview might explain why the Templars were accused of heresy, not because they worshipped strange idols or practiced forbidden rites, but because they were attempting to synthesize knowledge drawn from many traditions. To medieval authorities, such cross-cultural curiosity was suspect. To the Templars, it was necessary. If they believed humanity had once reached heights now forgotten, then recovering that legacy became not an intellectual pursuit but a sacred mission. Their archives, therefore, were not simply repositories of military orders and financial records. They were vaults containing the fragments of a story that predated all European kingdoms. It is within this context that rumors of connections between the Templars and the myth of Atlantis begin to take shape. The idea seems fantastical at first glance, yet it appears again and again in esoteric commentaries and later secret societies believed to have inherited Templar traditions. These groups often spoke of a lost maritime civilization, a network of knowledge-bearers who traveled the world before written history. Whether this was truly Atlantis or a symbolic reference to any number of drowned cultures, The Templars seemed drawn to the idea that the ocean concealed truths as profound as those beneath the Temple Mount. If they found any evidence linking the legends they carried from Europe to discoveries made in the Holy Land, it would have confirmed their belief that humanity's past was far more complex than the Church allowed. Such evidence, if it existed, would have needed to be protected at any cost. And so the Templars became custodians not merely of relics but of a narrative, one that cast the world not as a battleground between rival kingdoms, but as the stage for a repeating cycle of rise and destruction. They understood that knowledge itself could be a threat, and that revealing ancient truths might destabilize the institutions that ruled Europe. By the time the Order reached the height of its power, it had accumulated more than wealth. It had gathered stories, maps, artifacts, and coded teachings that pointed to a forgotten world drowned beneath the waves. Whether they believed that world was Atlantis or another civilization does not matter as much as the conviction that a great loss had occurred in humanity's distant past, and that the clues to that loss were scattered across continents, waiting to be pieced together. Their escape, then, was not just an act of survival. It was a continuation of a mission that began long before the Order was founded, and that would continue long after its banners disappeared from history. The Templars' relationship with the ancient world became even more enigmatic when one considers the extraordinary lands they traveled through during the Crusades. To most European knights, the Holy Land was simply a distant battleground soaked in the struggles of three great faiths. But to the Templars, especially their inner circle, it was something deeper. A crossroads of myth and memory, a place where the ruins of forgotten civilizations lay just beneath the dust, waiting to reveal truths far older than Christianity itself. As their influence grew, so did their exposure to stories and artifacts that hinted at cataclysms beyond anything described in Scripture. They witnessed structures carved with mathematical precision, engineering that defied their understanding, and oral traditions that spoke of cities destroyed not by war, but by the wrath of nature or something even more mysterious. While stationed in the Levant, the Templars encountered scholars who preserved legends of lands swallowed by the sea, of temples built by civilizations so advanced that later generations could not replicate their work. Many of these tales mirrored stories the knights had heard in Europe, Norse sagas of sunken islands, Celtic stories of drowned kingdoms, and Greek accounts of an empire wiped out in a single night. The consistency of these global legends may have startled the more educated members of the Order, who began to wonder whether these were not myths at all but fragments of a shared memory stretching back to humanity's earliest days. What impressed the Templars most, however, was not only the stories but the symbols. Across the Middle East, they found geometric patterns embedded in architecture, talismans, astronomical diagrams, and sacred art, many of which echoed the same proportions and shapes the Templars themselves would later use in their chapels and commanderies. Circles divided into precise measurements, intertwined triangles, spirals that mimicked celestial cycles. These were not the symbols of one culture but of many, suggesting a common origin older than any kingdom still standing. It was as though a long-lost mathematical language was imprinted across civilizations separated by vast distances and centuries of conflict. Some historians argue that these symbols influenced the Templars more profoundly than any relic or written text. Through them, the Knights began to conceive the world as a web of interconnected traditions, all pointing back to a lineage of knowledge once held by an advanced maritime culture. Whether that culture was Atlantis or another name lost to time was irrelevant. What mattered was the realization that humanity's oldest truths were not confined to any one region. They were scattered like seeds on the wind, preserved in temples, stories, and symbols that survived long after their source vanished beneath the waves. This perspective would have placed the Templars at odds with the religious authorities of their era. The medieval church promoted a singular, linear history beginning with biblical creation and culminating in divine prophecy. The notion that there had been civilizations before Adam, or catastrophes that reshaped continents before the flood, was considered deeply dangerous. If the Templars embraced the idea of a forgotten prehistoric world, one whose knowledge had survived quietly through esoteric traditions, they were stepping into theological territory forbidden to them. Yet the evidence they encountered in the East may have been too compelling to ignore. The more they learned, the more questions emerged. How could distant cultures share similar flood myths? Why did sacred architecture around the world rely on the same geometric ratios? What force could have destroyed an entire civilization so completely that only scattered fragments remained? And more importantly, did remnants of its knowledge still exist, hidden somewhere beneath land or sea? For a brotherhood sworn to protect secrets, such questions would have been irresistible. Their fascination with ancient architecture grew into a practical obsession. Templar engineers examined the ruins of Baalbek, whose massive foundation stones dwarfed anything built in medieval Europe. They studied the subterranean tunnels beneath Jerusalem, which showed signs of construction far older than the Second Temple. They compared these structures to stories they overheard from local guides, stories of a time when the world shuddered and oceans rose to engulf entire cities. Such accounts were usually dismissed as folklore, yet the Templars sensed a pattern. Each tale, no matter how exaggerated, contained a kernel of truth that aligned with other legends they encountered in far-flung regions. As they pieced together these clues, a quiet conviction began to spread within their ranks, that the world as they knew it was only the latest chapter in a much older story. Some of their leaders may have believed the Templars had been chosen, perhaps by fate, perhaps by a divine design, to protect the remnants of this forgotten legacy. Others may have suspected that the Church itself had inherited fragments of this ancient memory but suppressed what did not conform to doctrine. The Templars, with their comparatively open curiosity and access to multiple cultures, were uniquely positioned to recognize these suppressed truths. This growing awareness may have influenced the way the Templars interpreted their own mission. Protecting the Holy Land was only the surface-level justification. Beneath it lay a deeper, more esoteric purpose: to gather, preserve, and perhaps one day restore a wisdom that had once guided a long-lost civilization. Such a revelation would have changed the Templars' understanding of themselves. They were no longer simply knights or monks. They were custodians of humanity's hidden inheritance, inheritors of a mystery that predated the Church, the Crusades, and the kingdoms of Europe. This sense of sacred duty may also explain why certain Templar leaders seemed unfazed by the political storms brewing back west. If they truly believed they were participating in a mission that stretched across millennia, the schemes of kings would have seemed trivial by comparison. Their focus would have remained fixed on the clues they were gathering. Symbols carved into ruins, legends passed across generations, maps drawn with an accuracy no medieval geographer should possess. Every discovery reinforced the same idea, that the world had forgotten something monumental, something so immense that its rediscovery could reshape the very foundations of civilization. With each expedition, each conversation with Eastern scholars, and each examination of ruins older than biblical history, the Templars found themselves drawn deeper into a mystery that transcended borders and faiths. And with each revelation, they drifted further from the Church that had once blessed their formation. This growing divide was subtle at first, a quiet shift in perspective. But over time, it became the fault line that would eventually lead to their downfall, and the disappearance of the secrets they had sworn to protect. If they believed that the answers lay somewhere beyond the reach of kings and popes, then their ultimate destination may not have been Europe at all. It may have been across the waters, toward lands where legends spoke of ancient cities swallowed by time, where the remnants of a forgotten world might still be waiting. As the Templars gathered fragments of forgotten history from across the Holy Land, they began to notice a peculiar pattern in the ruins and relics they encountered. Certain symbols repeated themselves, marks that scholars could not translate, yet appeared with unmistakable consistency across sites separated by thousands of miles. Shapes carved into stone, etched into metal, and woven into ancient textiles seemed to speak a silent language the Templars were determined to decode. It was here, in the crumbling remains of civilizations the Church barely acknowledged, that the Knights first encountered a peculiar emblem, a trident-like figure intertwined with a circle, often accompanied by spirals or wave patterns. Local scholars offered different interpretations. Some claimed it represented a storm god. Others said it symbolized the world before the flood, a phrase the Templars found impossible to ignore. At first glance, these carvings appeared crudely made, but a closer inspection revealed an astonishing level of mathematical precision. The angles, ratios, and proportions embedded in the designs hinted at a knowledge of geometry and astronomy far beyond what medieval Europe would rediscover until centuries later. Knights trained in architecture and fortification recognized measurements embedded in the imagery, ratios that matched those used in distant megalithic structures, including ones the Templars would later adopt in their own chapels. These symbols, scattered across forgotten ruins, suggested the presence of an ancient culture whose influence extended far beyond any empire recorded in medieval chronicles. Such discoveries raised unsettling questions. How could simple villagers in the Middle East describe symbols nearly identical to those found in Celtic stone circles and Iberian cave patterns? Why did geometric carvings in the Levant mirror designs seen in North Africa and even the far northern coasts of Europe? The Templars realized that these commonalities could not be explained by coincidence. They pointed to a civilization that once spanned oceans, one that used symbols as a universal language to encode their understanding of the cosmos. Whether this culture was the fabled Atlantis or another forgotten people, the Templars sensed that they had stumbled upon evidence of a world far older and more interconnected than anyone in Christendom dared imagine. What disturbed the Knights most was the discovery of maps that seemed to reference coastlines vastly different from those drawn in their own day. Some appeared to depict shorelines before catastrophic flooding reshaped the continents. Others showed islands where none existed on medieval charts. Scholars claimed they were allegorical diagrams or religious abstractions. Yet certain Templars, especially those trained in navigation, recognized real geographical logic hidden beneath the symbolic forms. They noticed that many of these maps included markers near regions associated with ancient disasters, areas where legends claimed cities had been swallowed by the sea. The symbols on these maps appeared aligned with astronomical cycles, as though the cartographers had encoded celestial knowledge into the earthly landscape. The Templars began to question whether these symbols might represent not only locations but warnings. Some carvings depicted rising waves and tilted horizons, as if describing a world shaken by violent upheaval. Others featured celestial alignments that modern researchers would recognize as indications of planetary cycles or the positions of certain stars during significant epochs. The Knights were not astronomers in the modern sense, yet many had enough knowledge of the heavens to recognize that the patterns were too deliberate to be decorative. It was as though the ancients had attempted to preserve the memory of a disaster so immense it erased their entire civilization, leaving behind only fragments carved in stone, waiting for someone capable of understanding their message. With each new discovery, the Templars found themselves drawn deeper into the mysteries surrounding these symbols. They collected sketches, copied inscriptions, and preserved rubbings of carvings that European scholars would later dismiss as meaningless. Yet to the Templars, these markings echoed the warnings found in Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern traditions. Stories of a great drowning, a night when the earth shook, the seas rose, and fire rained from the sky. The similarities between these legends were too strong to ignore, and the symbols they found seemed to corroborate them. They began to suspect that these ancient warnings were not myths, but records of real events, cataclysms that had reshaped the world long before the founding of any empire. Some Templar leaders believed these symbols were part of a lost scientific system, a means of preserving knowledge across generations in case such disasters ever struck again. If that were true, then deciphering this language could grant insights into the forces that govern the earth and sky, knowledge that would have seemed like sorcery to medieval minds. The Knights understood the danger such knowledge posed if misinterpreted, but they also sensed its value. In a world ruled by superstition and divided by faith, the idea that humanity once shared a unified understanding of the cosmos was both inspiring and threatening. Those who sought to control the populace through fear would not hesitate to suppress any revelation that portrayed the world as far older, richer, and more mysterious than dogma allowed. Some chroniclers later claimed the Templars celebrated strange rites or revered unfamiliar symbols. These accusations were likely distortions of their scholarly pursuits. As they studied the ancient engravings, they may have incorporated certain mathematical or geometrical principles into their own architectural designs. Their chapels, especially the circular ones, reflected proportions reminiscent of the sacred geometry they encountered in ruins. To outsiders, these similarities could be misinterpreted as evidence of forbidden worship. In reality, They were manifestations of a knowledge that transcended religious boundaries, a desire to preserve the wisdom of a forgotten world. The further the Templars delved into these symbols, the more convinced they became that humanity had experienced at least one great reset, an event that erased nearly everything except fragments encoded in stories and stones. And if such an event had happened once, it could happen again. The symbols, in their eyes, were not merely remnants of the past. They were warnings about the future. Perhaps that is why the Templars guarded their discoveries so fiercely. They believed they had found a language designed to outlive civilizations, a system built to survive disaster and guide survivors back to knowledge once the world was ready again. It is no wonder, then, that the Templars became increasingly secretive. Their discoveries were too dangerous to share openly and too valuable to destroy. They began to store their findings in hidden vaults, coded manuscripts, and fortified temples. Only the highest-ranking members of the order were granted access to the full scope of their archive. And as the Church grew suspicious of their silence, the Templars only withdrew further into their own cryptic world. They had crossed a threshold, from warriors to custodians of a forgotten science, guardians of symbols that could rewrite history if placed in the wrong hands. What the Templars did not know was that their growing obsession with this ancient knowledge would draw the attention of powerful enemies. Men who feared that the symbols they studied might expose truths that could shatter the political and theological foundations of Europe. Their downfall was approaching, but for now, the Templars continued their quest, unaware that the very secrets they sought to protect might ultimately seal their fate. As the Templars pieced together the mysterious symbols carved across ancient ruins, their mission evolved from military duty to something far more profound, an investigation into humanity's forgotten origins. Yet while symbols and relics whispered their secrets in stone, there was another source of ancient memory that carried even more weight: the oral traditions of the local peoples. Stories passed from elder to child for thousands of years, carried across deserts, mountains, and coastlines. The Templars soon realized that these myths, despite coming from different tribes and regions, echoed each other with uncanny precision. What began as casual conversations around campfires slowly turned into systematic inquiries, as the knights realized they were hearing fragments of the same ancestral catastrophe repeated in different languages and metaphors. Some of the oldest families in the Levant spoke of a land that once rose from the sea like a crown of gold, ruled by priest-kings who understood the stars better than any astronomer alive today. According to these stories, the rulers of this ancient world could read the heavens as easily as a monk reads scripture. They charted the movements of planets and foretold storms, eclipses, and seasons with uncanny accuracy. But their wisdom did not save them. One night, after a series of celestial omens, the land was shaken by a thunderous roar. Waves rose taller than mountains, swallowing cities and gardens alike. Survivors fled in ships made of cedar and papyrus, scattering across the world to preserve whatever knowledge they could carry. They were called the People of the First Dawn, a title that lingered in multiple languages long after their homeland vanished. When the Templars heard these accounts, they were startled by how closely they matched legends they had learned as children in Europe: tales of High Brazil, Lyonesse, and the drowned realm of the Tuatha De Danann. They realized these stories might not be isolated fantasies or regional folklore. They might represent a shared memory encoded into the human psyche. Elders in the Middle East spoke of survivors who journeyed westward, building stone circles, teaching metalwork, and passing down sacred geometry so that future generations could rebuild. These storytellers did not know the name Atlantis, but their descriptions matched Plato's writings to an unnerving degree. It was as if the memory of the cataclysm had been preserved in dozens of different languages, each retelling preserving a sliver of the truth. The Templars also encountered Bedouin tribes who carried tales of star watchers, travelers who came from a land destroyed by fire. These wanderers had settled among their ancestors long before recorded history, teaching them to navigate by constellations and understand the shifting sands. The tribes described these ancient teachers as unusually tall, pale-skinned, and adorned with intricate markings resembling the same symbols the Templars found carved into ruins. The more the knights listened, the more they became convinced that these survivors were not mythical beings but members of a sophisticated tribe, displaced by a disaster that reshaped the world. Jewish Kabbalists, whose ancestors had lived in the region since time immemorial, shared another layer of the mystery. They spoke of a civilization destroyed because it pierced the veil of heaven, a poetic phrase that the Templars interpreted as a reference to advanced astronomical knowledge or technological mastery. According to these teachings, humanity goes through cycles of rise and fall, and when one generation reaches too close to the hidden workings of creation, the world resets itself through fire or water. The Templars, steeped in Christian theology, were unsettled by the idea of cyclical destruction, yet they could not dismiss the consistency with which these stories appeared. Then there were the sailors, Phoenician descendants who told stories inherited from their seafaring ancestors. They spoke of an island beyond the pillars, where temples gleamed like mirrors under the sun. They claimed the island sank after a violent quake, but not before its priests scattered across the world carrying scrolls, tools, and sacred stones. These sailors believed that some of the survivors reached North Africa and Iberia, teaching their knowledge to early tribes that would later influence the Celtic and Basque regions. To the Templars, who had seen spirals and geometric carvings in both the Holy Land and Europe, this story provided a link they had long suspected but could never confirm. At first, the Knights treated these stories as curiosities, ancient exaggerations meant to entertain. But the deeper they listened, the more they felt the weight of a forgotten truth. Every legend, no matter how embellished, contained the same core elements: a magnificent island, a sudden cataclysm, a migration of survivors, and the deliberate preservation of sacred knowledge. The Templars soon realized they were hearing eyewitness testimonies passed across generations. If these stories were true, then humanity had built advanced civilizations long before the oldest biblical records. This revelation would have been considered heresy by the Church, yet the Knights could not deny the evidence accumulating around them. What struck the Templars most was the emotional depth of these oral traditions. Many storytellers recited the legends with reverence, as if mourning a homeland they had never seen but still felt connected to. It was as though the trauma of the ancient disaster had imprinted itself on their cultural memory in the same way that deep sorrow marks a family lineage. Some elders wept as they described the night the sea rose to claim the cities of their ancestors. Others spoke with solemn pride, believing their people carried the last surviving fragments of a world that had perished. The Templars, accustomed to war and hardship, were moved by this ancestral grief. They sensed that the pain expressed in these stories was too visceral to be pure invention. The more the Templars listened, the clearer the picture became. The symbols they found carved in stone were not the work of a single ancient culture, but of a diaspora, survivors who had fled a global catastrophe and carried their knowledge with them. This realization changed everything. It meant that humanity's oldest secrets were not hidden in one place, but scattered across continents, preserved in fragments of story, symbol, and stone. The Templars began to understand that their task was not to protect a single relic or secret, but to piece together the remnants of an entire lost world. Yet as they gathered these stories, the Templars became aware of something more troubling. Some legends claimed that the survivors had also left behind warnings of future cataclysms, tied to celestial cycles and geological forces that return every few thousand years. The symbols they found may not have been mere records of the past, but prophetic signs meant to guide future generations through similar upheavals. If the Templars believed this, it would explain the burning urgency with which they protected their archives, their geometry, and their coded manuscripts. They were not merely historians. They saw themselves as guardians of a forgotten science that might one day save humanity. And as they realized this, a sense of destiny began to shape their actions. Their mission was no longer limited to the crusading efforts of kings or the political ambitions of the Church. They were reaching for something older, something sacred, a truth buried under layers of myth and memory, a truth that powerful men in Europe might never allow to see the light of day. As the Templars began to analyze the deeper meaning behind the symbols, they encountered a layer of complexity that none of them had expected. The carvings were not simply decorative motifs or religious emblems. They were encoded systems of knowledge that combined astronomy, geometry, and metaphysics in ways far beyond the understanding of medieval scholars. Many of the Knights, especially those trained in architecture, navigation, and mathematics, noticed recurring patterns that seemed deliberately structured, as if designed to teach through shape rather than words. Spirals, intersecting lines, triangular grids, and circles within circles appeared with such deliberate repetition that the Templars concluded these symbols were part of a universal code passed down from the ancient survivors themselves. One night inside a quiet stone chamber lit only by oil lamps, a group of Templar scholars gathered around a large tablet unearthed near a coastal ruin. The markings depicted a series of interwoven circles aligned precisely with the phases of the moon. A veteran navigator among them realized that the arrangement matched the lunar cycle used by ancient sailors to track tides and seasonal winds. But as they studied further, they discovered that the design also encoded mathematical ratios connected to the golden spiral, suggesting that the ancient civilization possessed a sophisticated understanding of natural harmonics. The combination of lunar cycles and geometric precision left the Templars awestruck. It implied not only advanced science but a worldview that saw cosmos, nature, and human existence as tightly interlinked. The more they decoded, the more they saw that this symbolic system was not bound by language or culture. Identical patterns emerged in distant regions. Carvings in Levantine ruins matched markings found earlier by European Templars on weather-worn standing stones in Brittany and Ireland. These parallels could not be dismissed as coincidence. It seemed the diaspora of ancient survivors had traveled far and wide, carrying with them not only stories and memories but a symbolic language intended to unify future generations across continents. The Templars began to suspect that this visual code served as a safeguard against the erosion of knowledge, allowing essential truths to outlive empires, religions, and spoken tongues. Yet understanding these symbols was not easy. Many of the Templars lacked the scholarly training to interpret astronomical data or complex geometry. So they worked collaboratively, combining the practical expertise of knights with the intellectual talents of monks, translators, and architects within the order. Their discussions stretched late into the night, with parchments spread across tables, compasses scraping against wooden surfaces, and murmured debates echoing through vaulted halls. They created illustrated manuscripts that attempted to replicate what they had seen, fearing that the original ruins might one day disappear. These manuscripts were treated with great secrecy, stored in hidden chambers and guarded by only a handful of trusted brothers. During their investigations, the Templars also realized that the symbols often appeared in sequences that formed elaborate narratives. One cluster of symbols told a story of a great celestial alignment, an event involving the sun, moon, and a specific arrangement of stars. The Templars could not determine whether this alignment represented a past catastrophe or a future one, but the accompanying imagery suggested upheaval and transformation. Another series depicted a journey across oceans, with arrows pointing toward multiple directions, indicating that after the destruction of their homeland, the ancient survivors dispersed intentionally, rather than randomly. These symbols gave the impression that the diaspora had been planned, almost as if the ancient people anticipated the disaster and prepared escape routes for different groups. Some symbols, however, were far more enigmatic. A recurring motif showed a figure standing at the center of interconnected circles, holding a staff with 3 points. This figure appeared in many variations across different ruins and traditions. The elders who shared oral stories often described a similar being: a guide, a scholar, or a wise traveler who helped lead the survivors through the chaos. The Templars debated whether this symbol represented an actual historical leader, a divine archetype, or a metaphor for knowledge itself. But regardless of its true meaning, they recognized its importance. It seemed to anchor the symbolic system, suggesting that leadership and wisdom were essential for survival during times of catastrophic change. As they studied deeper, the Templars began to suspect that these symbols formed a map, but not the kind that pointed to a physical treasure or hidden fortress. Instead, it appeared to be a map of cycles, a guide to understanding how civilizations rise, fall, and rebuild according to cosmic rhythms. This idea disturbed many within the order, especially those who believed that history moved in a straight line guided by divine will. But the symbols suggested something different, that the universe moved in repeating patterns and humanity's fate was bound to these larger forces. If this ancient knowledge was correct, then the catastrophe that destroyed the lost civilization might not have been a unique event. It could have been part of a recurring cycle, one that humanity might face again. The implications were enormous. The Templars realized that they were not simply uncovering old knowledge. They were inheriting a worldview that challenged everything they had been taught. It forced them to confront the possibility that current societies were far more fragile than they believed. If the ancients had been wiped out despite their advanced knowledge, what hope did medieval kingdoms have? This fear deepened the Templars' determination to preserve what they had discovered. They began to construct concealed vaults beneath fortresses, monasteries, and commanderies, storing copies of their decoded manuscripts along with sketches of symbols and maps of archaeological sites. Only a select circle of high-ranking members knew the full truth. To protect the knowledge, they developed coded languages of their own, ciphers, glyphs, and layered metaphors, ensuring that even if the documents were seized, only those trained in their system would understand the deeper meaning. As their research expanded, the Templars noticed a disturbing pattern. Many of the symbols pointed toward astronomical events involving the trajectory of the Earth itself, hinting at gravitational disturbances, shifting poles, or impacts from celestial bodies. Though medieval science lacked the tools to fully interpret these possibilities, the Templars could sense that the warnings were urgent. They began to fear that the ancient civilization had been destroyed by an event of cosmic magnitude, something that could recur. And if the symbols were indeed warnings, then humanity was living on borrowed time without even realizing it. This growing awareness connected the Templars to the ancient survivors in a way they had not expected. They felt as though they were continuing a mission that had begun long before their order existed. It gave them a sense of purpose deeper than any crusade or royal decree. They were protectors of a knowledge that had survived fire, flood, and the collapse of empires. A knowledge that might one day be the key to humanity's survival. The Templars eventually turned their attention toward the sea, the one domain where symbols, oral traditions, and lingering ruins all seemed to converge. From the earliest days of their discoveries, they had heard whispers of a forgotten maritime people, a group said to have mastered the oceans in an age long before recorded history. These legends described vessels capable of crossing vast distances, ships built with techniques that baffled even the most seasoned medieval shipwrights. The Templars began to suspect that the survivors of the lost civilization were not merely wandering refugees, but accomplished navigators who had spread their knowledge across coastlines and islands through deliberate voyages. As they explored the Mediterranean, they found ruins that seemed impossibly old, stone piers submerged beneath clear waters, breakwaters carved with spirals and directional lines, and seafloor structures arranged with mathematical precision. Local fishermen spoke of ancient walls beneath the waves, visible only in moments of perfect calm. The Templars, guided by curiosity and a growing sense of mission, began to dive into these shallow depths. Using ropes, weighted stones, and breath control passed from one daring knight to another, they brought up fragments of carved stone decorated with the same universal symbols they had seen inland. What disturbed them was not the carvings themselves, but their placement. Some structures were in waters too deep for ancient shorelines, suggesting either sinking landmasses or catastrophic floods that reshaped the coastline. One coastal ruin, near a rocky peninsula in the eastern Mediterranean, captivated them more than any other. Beneath 7 meters of water stood the remains of what appeared to be a circular harbor, its outer ring marked by carved stones in perfect arcs. The inner section formed a spiral pattern, its walls guiding currents in a controlled swirl. A Templar architect who examined the site remarked that such hydrodynamic engineering exceeded anything known in medieval Europe. More importantly, he noted that this spiral harbor resembled the concentric designs used in descriptions of Atlantis. Layers of rings, built with symbolic geometry meant to represent the order of nature. The Templars did not declare this place to be the lost city itself, but they began to wonder whether these were outposts or sanctuaries established by the survivors of the catastrophe. The Templars' maritime investigations soon expanded beyond archaeology. They also sought stories, fragments of memory preserved through generations by coastal families. One village elder spoke of a people of the dawn who fled the destruction of their homeland, arriving on ships that glowed in the sun like polished stone. Another legend described a fleet that vanished beneath a boiling sea after a fire fell from the sky. A third tale, preserved by seafarers who sailed between Greek islands, told of a compass that guided not by magnetism, but by the position of 3 stars during a once-in-a-century alignment. What unsettled the Templars was how these stories, gathered from distant regions, seemed to be describing variations of the same event. Driven by these clues, the order began to recruit skilled sailors and navigators into their ranks. These men taught them the secrets of currents, seasonal winds, and celestial navigation. By combining this new maritime expertise with the geometric knowledge encoded in the ancient symbols, the Templars developed maps unlike any others in Europe. Instead of simply tracing coastlines, their maps overlaid star patterns, tidal rhythms, and geometric alignments. They began to understand that the ancient seafarers navigated not just across the surface of the sea, but across a larger cosmic framework. Sea routes aligned with the heavens, as if the oceans themselves were mirrors of the sky. The more the Templars learned, the more they realized how little they knew. They discovered that the survivors of the lost civilization had not scattered randomly. Instead, they had followed precise maritime channels that wrapped around the Mediterranean and extended beyond its limits. The Templars charted what they believed to be the first leg of this migration, routes leading from the eastern Mediterranean through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Atlantic. They found carvings near the strait depicting ships traveling west toward the open sea. This raised an electrifying possibility. The ancient knowledge they sought might not be confined to Europe or the Levant. It might have traveled across oceans, reaching distant lands thousands of miles away. Some within the order resisted this idea, arguing that no civilization before Rome could have crossed the Atlantic. But the symbols told a different story. A series of spirals etched onto a stone slab found near a submerged ruin aligned perfectly with oceanic gyres, massive circular currents that govern global water movement. If the ancient mariners had understood these patterns, they would have been capable of navigating the ocean with astonishing efficiency. The Templars began to suspect that the survivors had reached shores far beyond Europe, perhaps influencing cultures that medieval scholars believed to have developed in isolation. These revelations changed the way the Templars viewed the sea. It was no longer a barrier but a highway connecting civilizations across time and space. If the ancient navigators had understood the rhythms of tides, stars, and storms, then the ocean itself had been part of their knowledge system, a vast, fluid archive capable of carrying ideas, symbols, and survivors to new worlds. The Templars, in turn, began to conceive of the ocean as a kind of memory, deep, layered, and filled with secrets waiting to be uncovered. Yet with every discovery came new fears. The more the Templars learned about the ancient maritime people, the more they sensed that the oceans held not only knowledge but warnings. The symbols describing celestial alignments often appeared alongside images of towering waves, split coastlines, and cities swallowed by rising water. These were not imagined tragedies. They were memories of a real event that had destroyed an entire civilization. The Templars began to wonder whether the ancient navigators had fled a second disaster or anticipated a future one. If the symbols were any indication, the ocean was both a refuge and a threat, a place of salvation and destruction depending on how well one understood its cycles. Despite their growing anxiety, the Templars pressed forward, convinced that they were following in the footsteps of a people who had once ruled the seas. They collected maritime legends, studied submerged ruins, and learned to read the ocean's patterns as if decoding a vast, living symbol. Each expedition left them with more questions, pulling them deeper into a mystery that felt both ancient and urgent. And somewhere in the midst of these explorations, a new idea began to take shape, an idea that would soon transform their mission entirely. Perhaps the key to understanding the lost civilization was not buried in the sands of ruined cities, but hidden beneath the waves in places where only the bravest dared to search. As the Templars pushed their investigations deeper into the maritime routes of ancient survivors, they began to confront stories and ruins that suggested something far more extraordinary. A deliberate migration across oceans to sanctuaries built in anticipation of catastrophe. The notion seemed impossible according to medieval understanding, yet every clue pointed toward an organized exodus. It was as if the lost civilization, aware of the destruction approaching, prepared a network of refuge sites placed far from the epicenter of the disaster. The Templars, driven by equal parts awe and dread, began piecing together the faint echoes of this journey, tracing the paths of a people who refused to let their knowledge be extinguished. Along remote coastlines, the knights inspected stones carved with patterns that mirrored constellations visible only from different latitudes, suggesting voyages that traveled far beyond the Mediterranean. They found systems of markers, a line of obelisks half buried in the sand, rock cairns balanced so precisely that storms could not topple them, and isolated carvings etched onto sea cliffs where only experienced sailors would notice. Many of these markers pointed toward deep ocean directions, far from common trade routes. When the Templars began to plot them on their maps, a strange geometry emerged. A constellation-like trail across the sea, as if the survivors had reconstructed the stars upon the water. The Templars realized these were not random relics but navigational beacons, carefully placed to guide ships away from danger. Some markers bore signs of deliberate concealment, as though later generations had tried to hide them from those unworthy of their knowledge. Weathered faces of stones were turned inward, inscriptions were buried under additional layers of rock, and some cairns appeared dismantled and rebuilt in ways that inverted their original meaning. It became clear that the ancient diaspora was not meant to be a widely known event. Only those initiated into the symbolic system could interpret the trail correctly. This secrecy resonated deeply with the Templars, who themselves relied on coded maps and guarded archives. The parallels strengthened their belief that they were inheriting a mission older than their own order. During one expedition, the Templars explored a chain of small islands far off the main trade routes. The islands were barren, windswept, and seemingly devoid of life, but on the third island they discovered something astonishing: an underground chamber carved into volcanic rock. Inside, stone shelves had been dug into the walls, though whatever they once held had long since been removed. At the center stood a pedestal bearing a single symbol, an inverted triangle encircling a cluster of small dots. One of the Templar astronomers recognized the formation immediately. It was the star grouping we now call the Pleiades. But beneath it, etched with uncanny precision, was a second constellation, one only visible from the southern hemisphere. The implication struck them like an electric shock. Whoever carved this chamber had traveled far enough south to see unfamiliar stars and had returned to mark the passage. The Templars recorded every detail, feeling the weight of history pressing around them. This was no myth. This was evidence of a seafaring culture capable of navigating global distances in an age when most medieval minds could barely conceive of lands beyond the horizon. But why had the chamber been emptied? Had the survivors returned for their stored items, or had someone else, centuries later, retrieved them? The Templars debated these questions in hushed tones, uneasy with the idea that another secretive group might be pursuing the same knowledge. That fear grew when they discovered that the entrance to the chamber had been sealed with a type of mortar far more recent than the original stonework. Someone in the centuries between had found the chamber, entered it, and carefully reclosed it. As the Templars pushed onward, they listened to stories passed down through island communities. Tales of pale-skinned strangers who arrived long before local tribes had settled, carrying objects of shining metal and tools capable of cutting stone like butter. Some legends described these visitors as teachers who shared the knowledge of stars, agriculture, and navigation. Others depicted them as desperate refugees fleeing a great roar in the sea. A few stories spoke of a pact between the newcomers and the islanders, that when the time came for the visitors to continue their journey, the islanders would guard their secrets until someone with the proper symbols returned. Hearing these tales, the Templars felt both excitement and a growing sense of solemn responsibility. It was becoming clear that the diaspora survivors had not acted out of fear. They had acted out of strategy, planting seeds of knowledge in scattered locations where future generations might rediscover them. One evening, as the Templar ship rested in a sheltered bay, the commander gathered his men and revealed a parchment he had kept hidden. It was an ancient map copied from ruins found months earlier. Unlike medieval maps, it did not show coastlines but instead depicted a series of wave-like arcs crossing the ocean. At first, the Templars assumed these represented wind patterns or currents, but upon closer study they realized the arcs lined up with seasonal star positions. The ancient navigators had created a map that integrated both sea and sky, allowing them to cross vast distances with astonishing precision. The Templar commander, overwhelmed by the implications, told his men that this map alone could rewrite everything Europe believed about exploration. As they sailed farther west, the sea grew deeper and the skies darker, as if they were leaving the known world behind. The ship's navigator reported strange magnetic fluctuations that caused their compass to spin unpredictably. Yet the symbols they followed remained consistent, guiding them toward a place where, according to oral tales, the waters held memory. Eventually, they anchored beside an uninhabited island where stone pillars rose like broken teeth from the beach. Here, the Templars found their most haunting discovery yet. A stone slab depicting a ship traveling beneath a blazing symbol that looked eerily like a comet. The carving showed waves rising higher than the ship's mast and a city crumbling in the background. This was not merely art, it was a record of tragedy, a memory of the destruction that drove the ancient people across the sea. The carving also depicted multiple ships, not one. This confirmed what the Templars had long suspected. The diaspora had not consisted of a single escape vessel but an entire fleet. A coordinated exodus on a scale that medieval Europe had never imagined. The image left them silent, humbled, and shaken. The catastrophe that had destroyed the ancient civilization had been real, devastating, and global in scope. Yet the survivors had possessed the knowledge, will, and unity to undertake a massive voyage that spanned continents. As the sun set behind the pillars, the Templars realized that they were following not just the echoes of a lost world, but the footsteps of a people determined to preserve their legacy against impossible odds. The ancient diaspora had not been a story of collapse. It had been a story of endurance, strategy, and hope. And now the Templars were beginning to understand that their own order was picking up a thread woven thousands of years earlier, connecting them to a forgotten lineage of guardians who believed that knowledge could save humanity from repeating its greatest catastrophes. The deeper the Templars sank into the mystery of the ancient diaspora, the more they began to notice a striking pattern. The survivors did not simply scatter. They established enclaves of knowledge, fortified outposts where fragments of their culture, science, and symbolism were carefully preserved. These enclaves were not cities in the traditional sense but sanctuaries, built in remote locations where outsiders rarely ventured. They stood on high cliffs overlooking treacherous waters, nestled deep inside mountain valleys, or hidden beneath forest floors where centuries of growth had swallowed their entrances. Each sanctuary carried the unmistakable fingerprints of the lost civilization, a fusion of geometry, astronomy, and sacred architecture. The Templars first heard of these enclaves from coastal elders who spoke of silent builders, people who erected great stone structures in total secrecy. These builders were said to have arrived in small groups, worked with intense precision, and vanished just as quietly, leaving behind nothing but perfectly fitted stones that even earthquakes could not dislodge. Local tribes had never known their language or their purpose, yet they treated the sites with reverence, fearing the powerful knowledge they were said to contain. The Templars, recognizing the same symbolic patterns from earlier expeditions, began searching for these enclaves with growing determination. Their first confirmed discovery came in a remote coastal forest where the trees grew thick and ancient, towering so high that sunlight reached the forest floor only in narrow beams. Guided by stories of a stone labyrinth hidden beneath the roots, the knights spent days clearing brush until they uncovered the entrance to a concealed chamber. What they found inside left them speechless. The chamber walls were lined with stone panels arranged in a spiraling sequence, each carved with symbols the Templars recognized as astronomical markers. The spiral formation matched the layout of a star cluster visible only during specific seasonal alignments that the ancient diaspora would have relied upon during their voyages. It became clear that this sanctuary had served as an astronomical library, preserving celestial knowledge that was essential to navigation. Yet one detail disturbed them. Many panels had been deliberately removed. The empty spaces on the walls bore marks where the stones had once been pried out with great care. Someone had come here long after the sanctuary's creation and taken pieces of its knowledge elsewhere. Whether these individuals were guardians, thieves, or descendants of the original builders was impossible to determine. But the Templars understood immediately that the sanctuaries were not abandoned. They were part of a living chain of inheritance. As they continued investigating, the Templars found that each enclave had its own purpose. Inland sanctuaries often focused on geometry and mathematics, with interconnected chambers forming precise harmonic ratios. In one such site, hidden deep within a ravine carved by ancient glaciers, they discovered a stone table shaped like an elongated octagon. When sunlight struck the table at midday, it cast shadows in perfect alignment with 8 carved grooves, each representing a mathematical constant. Templar scholars took careful notes, realizing that these grooves might encode instructions for constructing stable structures resistant to earthquakes or floods. The idea that the ancient civilization had passed down engineering knowledge designed to safeguard future generations deeply impressed the order. Another enclave, discovered high on a plateau reachable only by a narrow, winding path, featured a series of basins carved into the ground. When filled with water, the basins reflected the night sky with uncanny clarity, as though transforming the plateau into a living star chart. The Templars spent hours observing the reflections, noting that certain basins aligned with the rising of specific stars during solstices and equinoxes. It dawned on them that this place was a teaching site, an outdoor classroom used to educate future navigators or astronomer priests in the patterns of the heavens. The Templars could almost imagine the ancient survivors gathered here in silent contemplation, passing knowledge from one generation to the next under an unbroken sky. However, not all enclaves were peaceful sanctuaries dedicated to teaching. The Templars soon encountered structures that suggested defensive architecture. Massive walls, fortified gates, and traps designed to deter intruders. One such site stood on a rocky promontory battered by relentless waves. The fortress had been carved directly into the cliffside, its outer face featuring interlocked geometric patterns that diverted rainwater in ways the Templars did not fully understand. Inside, narrow corridors twisted into blind corners, and hidden alcoves contained remnants of metallic objects corroded beyond identification. At the center of the fortress lay a sealed chamber marked with a symbol the Templars had seen only once before. A circle divided into 4 quadrants, each containing a different constellation. It was the emblem associated with guardianship, found in earlier manuscripts that hinted at a lost order of protectors tasked with preserving sacred knowledge. The Templars realized they were standing inside a refuge created by an ancient brotherhood whose mission mirrored their own. But the most haunting of all enclaves was discovered entirely by accident. During a stormy voyage, the Templars' ship was forced to anchor near a rocky island almost perpetually shrouded in fog. While exploring its shoreline, they came upon a narrow fissure in the cliff. Inside, the fissure opened into a vast cavern whose walls glowed faintly with bioluminescent moss. At the far end of the cavern, they found a stone platform surrounded by circular etchings. In the center of the platform lay a perfectly preserved stone map, an elaborate design showing a series of concentric rings radiating outward from a single point. The point was marked with a symbol the Templars knew well, the spiral of destruction, used by the ancient civilization to represent the cataclysm that had ended their world. The rings surrounding it displayed migration paths, time cycles, and star alignments. This was not merely a sanctuary. It was a memorial built to remember the greatest tragedy in their history. Standing before the map, the Templars felt the full weight of the ancient civilization's loss. They were no longer just investigating relics. They were witnessing the echoes of a people who had endured unimaginable devastation and yet had fought to preserve their identity, their wisdom, and their hope for the future. The sanctuaries were not relics of a forgotten world but messages, warnings and teachings sent across time for any who would understand them. The Templars' understanding deepened as they studied these enclaves. They realized that the ancient survivors had not merely saved pieces of their knowledge. They had distributed it deliberately across regions, embedding clues in architecture, symbols, and oral traditions. No single sanctuary held the whole truth. Only by following the entire network could one piece together the full legacy. It was a system designed to protect knowledge from destruction and misuse, ensuring that it could be rediscovered only by those with the discipline, intelligence, and courage to seek it. And now the Templars found themselves walking this path, reassembling a puzzle stretching across continents and centuries. Each sanctuary they uncovered sharpened their sense of destiny, as if they were being drawn into a mission far larger than their own order. But with every revelation came new questions, and with every clue came the unsettling awareness that someone else, somewhere, might be following the same trail, someone who might not share the Templars' intentions. As the Templars pieced together the fragments of knowledge they had uncovered, their investigations began to take on a darker tone. The more they learned, the more they became aware of the stakes involved. The ancient survivors who had scattered across the globe had left behind not just clues but potential dangers. These survivors, driven by a desperation to preserve their knowledge in the face of overwhelming catastrophe, had created a system that could be easily misused or misunderstood. The Templars now understood that they were not simply following in the footsteps of an ancient people. They were on the verge of discovering secrets that could rewrite history, secrets that others might be seeking as well. One particular revelation sent a chill down their spines. There were signs that the survivors had not only hidden their knowledge in remote enclaves, but had also encoded it in a way that would require certain conditions to unlock. Some of these conditions were physical, the alignment of stars, the arrival of specific celestial events, but others were far more unsettling. In their search for a sanctuary deep within a dense jungle, the Templars had come across a stone gate carved with intricate patterns. As they examined it, they noticed that some of the carvings glowed faintly in the moonlight. These markings, while seemingly simple geometric shapes, reacted to the touch of certain materials. When a Templar placed a small shard of ancient pottery against one of the lines, the stone gate creaked open, revealing a chamber that had remained sealed for millennia. Inside, the chamber was empty save for a single stone pedestal upon which rested an object wrapped in a layer of what appeared to be ancient cloth. When the object was unwrapped, the Templars found themselves staring at a beautifully crafted artifact. A compass, but unlike any compass they had ever seen. This compass, its needle unmarked by any of the conventional directions, seemed to point toward something else, something beyond the horizon, beyond the known world. It pointed toward the deep ocean, toward the unknown. The Templars recognized this as a marker, a symbol of guidance for those who sought the lost knowledge that had once been spread across the seas. But what was its purpose? And why had it been hidden away, guarded by mechanisms meant to deter the unworthy? The more they pondered the compass's significance, the more they began to realize the depth of the challenge they faced. This was not simply about recovering lost knowledge, it was about safeguarding it. The ancient survivors had been wise enough to hide their most precious discoveries, knowing that such knowledge could be dangerous if misused. But had the Templars, in their pursuit of the truth, become vulnerable to the very temptation that had corrupted others before them? As they delved deeper into the secrets they had uncovered, they began to question whether they had the moral authority to wield such knowledge. Could they be trusted with the knowledge of the lost civilization, or were they too blinded by their own ambitions? This tension reached its peak when the Templars uncovered an ancient manuscript, its fragile pages almost disintegrating in their hands. The manuscript, written in a script that no modern scholar could decipher, contained detailed accounts of the ancient civilization's final days. What was revealed in those pages shocked the Order to its core. The survivors had not simply fled to the seas in fear of the impending catastrophe. They had left behind a warning, a prophecy of sorts, that foretold the end of their civilization and the coming of another great cataclysm. But this warning was not just about the world they had known. It was about the future. The manuscript spoke of an event that would bring about the collapse of human civilization once again, a repeating cycle that had been predicted in the stars long before the survivors had set sail. The manuscript also described an artifact, an object that could change the course of humanity's destiny, but only if it was used wisely. The Templars realized with growing unease that they had already encountered this artifact during their journey, the very compass they had found in the jungle. The manuscript described it as the key to unlocking a deeper understanding of the universe, a device capable of guiding those who wielded it toward the right path, but only if they were worthy. The object had been crafted with a set of precise instructions embedded in its structure, instructions that had been hidden within the geometry of the compass itself. Only those who understood the ancient symbols and the ways in which they interacted could unlock its true power. The implications were staggering. The Templars now found themselves at a crossroads. They could choose to keep this knowledge to themselves, protecting it from the world, or they could attempt to use it to reshape the future, possibly preventing the disaster that the ancient survivors had foreseen. But who could be trusted with such power? And what if their own understanding was flawed? What if the very act of seeking this knowledge had already set in motion the chain of events that would lead to the next great catastrophe? The tension grew as the Templars discovered more sanctuaries, each one revealing more about the lost civilization's understanding of the cosmos and its warnings about the future. They found places where the ancient survivors had mapped not just the stars, but the patterns of human behavior, the rise and fall of civilizations, the cycles of destruction and renewal. The survivors had learned that the key to surviving the next catastrophe lay not in preventing the inevitable, but in understanding the cycles of history and preparing for them. It was a lesson that resonated deeply with the Templars, who had seen their own order rise to power only to fall from grace, their secrets scattered to the winds. One particular discovery stood out among all the others: a hidden library, buried beneath a crumbling temple deep within a mountain range. The library contained scrolls that described the advanced sciences and philosophies of the ancient civilization. These scrolls spoke of an understanding of the universe far beyond anything the Templars had encountered in their own studies of the natural world. They described not just the mechanics of the cosmos, but the spiritual principles that governed it. The ancient survivors had known how to tap into the unseen forces that shaped reality, and they had passed down their knowledge in a coded form, embedding their understanding of the universe in the symbols and geometry that the Templars had been following all along. The library also contained a final message, written in a language so ancient that it took the Templars' finest scholars weeks to translate. The message was a warning that the survivors of the lost civilization had not escaped the coming destruction, they had merely delayed it. The cycle would repeat, and those who came after would be faced with the same choices and challenges. But there was hope. The message spoke of a new generation, one that could break the cycle and guide humanity toward a different future, if only they understood the lessons hidden within the sanctuaries. The Templars now stood at the precipice of a decision that could change the course of history. The ancient survivors had left behind not just a map of the stars, but a blueprint for the future. They had hidden their knowledge in the most remote corners of the world, knowing that only those who were worthy would be able to find it. But the Templars had come to understand something far more profound. The knowledge was not meant to be hoarded or protected. It was meant to be shared, but only with those who understood its deeper meaning. The challenge was not in finding the knowledge, but in knowing how to use it. As the Templars prepared to leave the hidden library and continue their search, they were confronted by the ultimate question. Could they, in good conscience, unlock the full potential of this ancient knowledge, or had they already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? They had uncovered the secrets of a lost civilization, but they now faced the greatest challenge of all: understanding how to wield it without falling prey to the same mistakes that had brought the ancients to ruin. The ocean had always been a place of mystery for the Templars, but now it became something more: a threshold, a veil, a silent witness to a history older than memory itself. After decoding the ancient compass and studying the star maps left behind by the survivors, the Templars realized that many of the sanctuary sites they had explored were not the final destinations at all. They were markers, signposts, warnings. The true archive, the one that contained the deepest secrets, had been placed somewhere no conqueror could reach, no empire could plunder, and no war could destroy. It lay beneath the waves, hidden in a realm the ancients had believed sacred: the great, unbroken ocean. The Templars set their sights on the sea, but they did so with a mixture of dread and determination. They had already uncovered enough to know that the survivors had viewed the ocean not merely as an escape route, but as a sanctuary in itself. Some texts even suggested that the survivors believed the ocean was alive, responsive, almost protective. They wrote of currents that shifted unnaturally, of locations where compasses spun wildly, and of strange lights that flickered beneath the waves. At first, the Templars dismissed such stories as the embellishments of frightened refugees. But now, with the ancient compass in hand, they were no longer so certain. Their attention turned to a region whispered about in old sailors' tales, waters where ships vanished without a trace and where storms appeared with no warning. The ancients had called it the boundary of the deep, and several of the sanctuary inscriptions hinted at its importance. Modern maps knew it by another name, but centuries earlier it had already become infamous. It was a place where the sky darkened even on clear days, where birds refused to fly, and where the ocean seemed to swallow sound itself. If the lost archive existed anywhere, the Templars believed it would be here. Gathering a small fleet of loyal vessels, the kind that answered only to the higher ranks of the order, they prepared for a journey unlike anything they had ever undertaken. These were not crusader ships meant for battle, nor merchant vessels laden with cargo. They were old, sturdy crafts capable of enduring storms and long voyages, modified in secret with reinforced hulls and hidden storage chambers. The Templars knew they would be crossing into dangerous waters, both physically and spiritually. The sea had a way of stripping men down to their essence, revealing their fears, their faith, and their limits. They went willingly, but with heavy hearts. During the early days of the voyage, morale remained high. The ocean was calm, the skies clear, and the compass pointed unerringly toward a distant, invisible point. But the deeper they traveled, the more the sense of unease grew. Birds disappeared first, vanishing from the skies as if they had reached the edge of their natural world. Then the winds shifted, unpredictable and cold, carrying whispers that none could explain. Some of the younger Templars began to speak of feeling watched, though no ship or creature appeared on the horizon. The ocean itself seemed to become denser, as though they were passing through layers of unseen boundaries. The water darkened, gaining an unnatural clarity that allowed them to see deeper than normal, and yet revealed nothing. No fish, no drifting kelp, no signs of life at all. It was as if they had sailed into a place where the laws of nature worked differently, where something vast and ancient hovered just out of sight. One night, as the ships drifted under a moon veiled in thin clouds, the compass began to glow faintly. The Templars gathered around it in silence. The needle, which had always pointed firmly toward the southwest, now trembled, as though caught between competing forces. The men held their breath. After several tense seconds, the needle settled, but it now pointed straight downward, toward the ocean floor. A murmur rippled through the crew. They had reached the place. The Templars lowered their anchors and sent divers into the dark water. Not ordinary divers, but trained specialists who had spent years practicing deep submersions in preparation for unknown challenges. These men descended into the depths, guided by lines connected to the ship. Hours passed. When they finally resurfaced, their faces were pale and their voices shaking. They spoke of enormous stone shapes far beneath them, shapes too regular, too geometric to be natural. Ridges, pillars, and structures arranged in patterns no ocean current could have carved. One diver described seeing an archway framed by carvings similar to those found in the jungle sanctuary. Another claimed he saw a massive circular platform, possibly a roof or floor of a submerged building. The Templars were stunned. They had expected ruins, perhaps, but not something so precise, so intact. These were not random remnants of a civilization swept out to sea. They were deliberate constructions, positioned with purpose. And they were enormous. The following days were spent in careful descent and documentation. The divers reported more details. Broad staircases leading into the darkness, murals carved into stone walls, and strange metallic shards unlike anything natural. The water around the ruins felt unnaturally still, as though the ocean itself respected the structures. Even the currents seemed to swirl around them, never touching the ancient stone. Then came the first major breakthrough. One diver surfaced carrying a small, perfectly preserved artifact, a triangular stone tablet etched with the same symbols found in the hidden library. The Templars knew instantly that this was a key, a message left for those who were able to follow the path. It was confirmation beyond doubt that the underwater structures were part of the ancient survivors' final plan. They had not simply fled into the ocean, they had built something within it, something meant to endure. As they studied the tablet, they identified a series of geometric patterns that corresponded to the compass's markings. The message was clear. The ruins beneath them were only the threshold. The archive itself lay deeper still, beyond the reach of simple divers. The survivors had built an entire submerged city, or perhaps an observatory, designed to be revealed only when the right tools, the right knowledge, and the right people converged. The Templars felt a mixture of triumph and terror. For centuries, legends had spoken of an island that vanished beneath the waves, Atlantis. But what if Atlantis had not sunk by accident? What if it had been lowered, hidden, sealed away for protection? And what if the Templars were now standing above its gates? Yet, as the realization grew, so did the weight of responsibility. If the archive held knowledge capable of predicting or preventing the next cycle of destruction, then every decision they made here mattered. They could not proceed carelessly. They could not risk awakening something that had been dormant for thousands of years. On the horizon, clouds began to gather, darker than any they had seen before. The ocean shifted beneath them, restless, as though aware of the unfolding discoveries. The ancient compass vibrated faintly, its glow pulsing like a heartbeat. The Templars understood. They were no longer merely explorers. They were intruders in a sanctum that had been protected by time, fate, and the will of a lost civilization. Whatever they did next would shape not only their own destiny, but perhaps the destiny of humanity itself. Their next descent would take them deeper than ever before, into the heart of the ruins, where the truth of the lost archive awaited, guarded by mysteries the ocean had kept hidden since the dawn of memory. The storm that gathered over the Templar fleet felt different from any they had encountered on the open sea. It was not merely a clash of weather. It felt like a boundary being crossed, like a warning from the ocean itself. The sky darkened in unnatural layers, turning from deep gray to an almost metallic black, while lightning flickered high above the clouds, illuminating the water with eerie flashes. The ships creaked under the shifting waves, and the men whispered prayers under their breath. For the first time since their journey began, even the hardened knights felt their courage tested. Yet the compass continued to glow, pulsing with quiet insistence, as though urging them to hold their ground. Despite the storm's fury, the needle remained steady, pointing downward toward the submerged structures beneath them. The Templars realized that this was no ordinary tempest. It had formed too quickly, too precisely above the site. The ancient survivors had warned, in their final message, that certain sanctuaries were protected, not by walls or guards, but by the elements themselves. The ocean did not want to be disturbed. Still, the Templars pressed forward. They secured their vessels with reinforced anchors and prepared for a deeper descent than any before. This time, they would not rely solely on their divers. They had brought with them a marvel of early engineering, a submersible chamber constructed in secret workshops far from prying eyes. It was little more than a reinforced metal sphere with small glass viewports, operated by a hand crank system that controlled ballast weight. Primitive by modern standards, but extraordinary for its time. A handful of elite knights, trained in both engineering and deep-water descent, prepared to enter the chamber. Before they descended, the Templars gathered on the deck for a final briefing. Maps were spread out, soaked with sea spray, illuminated by flickering lanterns. The stone tablet retrieved from the ruins lay beside them, its symbols meticulously copied onto parchment. It described a path, a sequence of chambers, and a warning. The sea remembers what the land forgets. No one was entirely sure what it meant, but its tone carried weight. The ancient survivors had gone to great lengths to protect their archive, not just from conquerors, but from the passage of time itself. The chamber lowered into the ocean with a slow, groaning descent. The water closed around it like a living thing, swallowing the sphere and carrying it down into the depths where light could no longer reach. Inside, the knights lit small lanterns and peered through the glass at the dark world unfolding below. At first there was nothing but blackness. Then, faintly, the structures appeared. A lattice of stone, pillars rising like the ribs of a colossal skeleton, and immense walls covered in carvings. The deeper they went, the clearer the ruins became. To their astonishment, the structures looked almost untouched by erosion. Time had worn at the edges, but the shapes, the symmetry, the deliberate architecture remained unmistakable. It was as if the sea itself had preserved this place. As they drifted closer, the chamber's lantern light revealed murals etched with stunning precision. Spirals, constellations, patterns resembling mathematical sequences, and depictions of tall, robed figures with elongated features. These were not mere decorations, they were instructions, records, data encoded in art. The submersible moved cautiously through a vast archway, descending into what appeared to be an enormous courtyard. Massive columns lined the space, rising from the seabed like the trunks of an underwater forest. The knights felt an overwhelming sense of presence, as though thousands of years of history pressed in around them. Something about the place felt alive, not in a literal sense but as if it possessed memory. The compass reacted again. Its glow brightened, and its needle began to shift, guiding the chamber toward a downward-sloping passage partially buried under silt. The structure seemed designed for water. The passage was smooth, sloped gently, and large enough to accommodate vessels or objects much bigger than the chamber itself. The Templars realized that the survivors had known their creation would one day be submerged. This was no accident. The archive had been built for the ocean. As they moved deeper inside, faint bioluminescent growths began to appear along the walls, thin lines of light tracing the carvings. It was as though the symbols had awakened, responding to the presence of the compass. The knights inside the chamber exchanged stunned looks. The patterns pulsed in sequence, leading them forward. It was not random. It was guidance. Eventually, the passage opened into a grand hall, so large that their lanterns could not reach the far walls. The floor had collapsed in places, revealing deeper chambers beneath. Along one intact section of wall, they saw something breathtaking. A massive circular carving embedded with metal inlays. Concentric rings, each filled with symbols representing astronomical cycles, geological ages, seismic activity, and something else, patterns that looked like tidal or gravitational diagrams, mapped with extraordinary precision. One knight whispered, barely able to speak, "This is not just history, it is a record of the earth itself." Another ring depicted cities, some recognizable, others lost to myth, falling beneath waves, collapsing under earth, burning in volcanic fire. It was a timeline of destruction. The last ring, barely visible, depicted a future cataclysm. It was not dated. It was not specified. But the implication was clear. Cycles repeat. Civilizations rise, collapse, and rise again. A low rumble vibrated through the structure, and for a moment the chamber shook. Silt drifted upward in clouds. The knights froze. The ruins were not collapsing. Something else was happening. The symbols along the walls lit more brightly, as if responding to the rumble. The compass vibrated violently, its glow now almost blinding. Then, without warning, the floor beneath the chamber gave way in a controlled collapse. Not a natural failure, but a mechanism triggered by the presence of the compass. The submersible dropped several meters before coming to rest inside a lower chamber. When the silt cleared, the knights found themselves staring at a sight that stole their breath. A vault, sealed for thousands of years, now partially revealed. Its entrance was framed by 3 massive stone doors, each carved with different scenes. One of creation, one of destruction, and one of rebirth. The symbols beneath each panel matched the patterns the Templars had found in the hidden library and the jungle sanctuary. This was it, the central archive, the heart of the ancient knowledge. Yet it was not the carvings that unnerved them. It was the realization that the vault was not fully submerged. A pocket of air existed inside, preserved by the architecture. It meant that someone could enter physically, walk its halls, touch its contents. The survivors had built a sanctuary within the sea that would endure until the right seekers arrived. The knights exchanged a single glance. They had reached the threshold of the greatest discovery in human history. But they also sensed the weight of a choice pressing upon them. A choice that could change not just their fate, but the fate of the world that would come after. Behind them, the storm raged. Before them, the vault waited. And deep inside the forgotten city beneath the waves, something ancient stirred, as though awakened by their presence. The moment the Templars realized the vault was accessible, that a pocket of air existed inside the submerged structure, everything changed. It meant the ancient survivors had not merely sealed their knowledge away to be forgotten. They had planned for this place to be entered. They had designed it with an understanding of pressure, architecture, and water displacement far beyond anything the medieval world could comprehend. And more importantly, they had left it intact, waiting for the right hands. As the submersible chamber settled on the stone platform inside the lower hall, the knights took a long, trembling breath. The lantern light flickered against the walls, casting strange shadows across the carved scenes of creation, destruction, and rebirth. The vault doors towered before them, massive slabs of stone decorated with symbols that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Each door radiated its own presence, its own gravity. The Templars secured the chamber's hatch and moved cautiously into the air pocket. Their boots stepped onto ancient stone untouched by sunlight for thousands of years. The air, though cold and heavy, was surprisingly breathable, hinting at some ancient ventilation system hidden within the architecture. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the faint dripping of water echoing in the dark, as if the ocean were gently tapping at the walls, reminding them that it could reclaim this place at any moment. The knights lit torches, their flames dancing against the smooth, engraved surfaces. Every detail felt intentional, every line, every symbol, every angle. It was as though the vault was communicating, inviting them to understand its language. The triangular tablet recovered earlier seemed to hum faintly in the presence of the great doors, its etched patterns catching the torchlight in new ways. The first door, the door of creation, depicted a world shaped by hands both divine and scientific. It showed stars being measured, continents being charted, and early humans receiving gifts of knowledge from tall, robed beings. Whether these were symbolic depictions or records of an actual ancient encounter, the Templars could not say. But one thing was certain. The survivors had possessed a worldview that merged science, spirituality, astronomy, and mathematics into a single cohesive philosophy. The second door, the door of destruction, showed scenes of cities crumbling beneath tidal waves, mountains erupting in fire, and entire civilizations fleeing into the sea. But hidden among the chaos were symbols of calculation, precise measurements of fault lines, celestial alignments, planetary cycles. The destruction had not been random. It had been predicted, and the survivors had prepared for it. The third door, the door of rebirth, was the most enigmatic of all. It showed a future that had not yet happened. Figures walking out of the ocean, carrying knowledge back into the world. A new dawn rising over unfamiliar lands. And at the center of the carving, a shape unmistakably like the Templar cross, but older, more geometric, more primal. The knights stood frozen. Had the ancient survivors foreseen the Order's existence? Had they left this place for them, or for someone like them? One of the senior knights, a man known for his calm reasoning, approached the third door and placed the triangular tablet into a recess that matched its shape. Instantly, the carvings on the door glowed faintly, illuminating the hall with a soft, golden light. The knights stepped back in awe as ancient mechanisms rumbled to life. Stones shifted, gears hidden within the walls rotated, and centuries of silence were broken. Slowly, the door of rebirth began to open. Beyond it lay a long corridor stretching into the darkness, supported by towering stone arches. The walls were lined with shelves carved directly into the rock, each containing sealed containers. Crystalline cylinders, clay tablets, metallic plates etched with patterns, and fragments of machinery whose purpose was impossible to guess. It was a library, but not merely of words. It was a library of civilization itself. The Templars stepped inside, their torches barely illuminating the vast expanse. As they moved deeper, they discovered something astonishing. The archive was organized. The ancient survivors had categorized their knowledge into distinct sections: astronomy, medicine, engineering, navigation, spiritual philosophy, and more. Each section was marked by unique symbols and color-coded indicators that still retained their pigments. But it was the central chamber that drew the knights' attention. At the heart of the archive was a raised platform surrounded by concentric rings of symbols. Upon it rested a circular device, crafted from a metal they had never seen. Its surface was smooth and warm to the touch, humming with a subtle energy. The device resembled a disc, engraved with constellations and geometric patterns that mirrored those on the ancient compass. In the center was a small indentation shaped exactly like the compass itself. The realization hit them almost simultaneously. The compass was not simply a guide. It was a key. With trembling hands, the knight who carried the compass stepped onto the platform. He looked back at his companions, receiving silent nods of encouragement. Then, slowly, he placed the compass into the indentation. The effect was immediate. Light erupted from the disc, traveling through the concentric rings like ripples across water. The symbols on the walls glowed in response. The entire archive seemed to awaken, as though recognizing an old friend. Patterns shifted, aligning themselves into new configurations. The air vibrated with a low, resonant hum. And then, from deep within the structure, a voice, neither human nor mechanical, echoed through the chamber. It spoke not in words, but in tones, in pitches that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly within the mind. The Templars felt the message more than they heard it. It was a greeting, a recognition, a warning, and a question. Were they worthy? The device projected a series of images, star maps, seismic charts, historical cycles of collapse. It showed the rise and fall of civilizations much older than humanity, civilizations erased long before the survivors of Atlantis built their oceanic sanctuaries. It depicted a universe governed by repeating patterns, where knowledge had been gained, lost, rediscovered, and extinguished over countless eras. The Templars stood motionless, overwhelmed by the realization that humanity was not the first, nor would it be the last, to walk this path. Another wave of images followed, this time showing the future. Not a prophecy, but a possibility based on the same repeating cycles. It showed storms, floods, wars, and a great shift in the Earth's magnetic field. But it also showed hope. Knowledge carried forward by those brave enough to protect it, forming the foundation of a renewed world. The Templars understood the meaning instantly. The archive was not meant to save a single civilization. It was meant to break the cycle, but only if humanity learned from it. As the visions faded, the device dimmed, and the hall returned to its quiet glow. The knights stood in silence, shaken to their core. They realized that the existence of this archive was a responsibility beyond anything their order had ever imagined. If this knowledge spread without guidance, it could spark panic, chaos, or worse, be weaponized by kings and empires. But if hidden completely, humanity would walk blindly into the same fate that had destroyed so many before. The burden was now theirs. The decision was now theirs. And as they gathered around the glowing vault, one heavy truth settled over them. Whatever path they chose, there would be no turning back. The sea around the Azores changes shape depending on the season. In summer, it glitters like polished obsidian. In winter, it grows turbulent, pulling at the edges of the cliffs as if trying to reclaim them. It is here, in this shifting realm between calm and fury, that geologists uncovered something that would challenge conventional history. A series of enormous submerged terraces carved into the basalt seafloor. These weren't gentle slopes formed by currents. They were deliberate, angular, and geometrically consistent, as if someone had stepped down the mountain into the sea with a chisel the size of a cathedral door. Divers who first mapped the terraces described them as too perfect, as though a civilization had carved platforms into rock long before the ocean swallowed them. The deepest terrace lay nearly 100 meters down, making it far older than any known human structure in the region. Yet it shared architectural logic with ancient step pyramids found across the world. Each terrace had the same proportional ratio, the same rise and run, and the same uncanny orientation to true north. But the real mystery began when sonar scans revealed not just the terraces but a linear trench running parallel to them. Straight, uniform, and smooth. It stretched for nearly half a kilometer before disappearing beneath a mound of volcanic debris. The trench had no natural explanation. It was too consistent, too clean, too deliberate. Some scientists proposed it might be a fault line. Others insisted it was the result of ancient lava flows. But one marine archaeologist offered a theory that would ignite controversy. The trench looked remarkably similar to a dry dock, an ancient ship-fitting station carved directly into rock, like those used in the Mediterranean centuries later. If that theory held even a sliver of truth, it would mean someone had the engineering skill to create monumental maritime infrastructure before recorded history even began. And not just infrastructure, they had built it in the middle of the Atlantic, thousands of miles from any known early civilization. But the terraces and trench were only the beginning. To the north, another anomaly emerged during a deep sonar sweep, a massive, triangular structure lying half-buried under sediment. Its edges were sharp enough to measure with precise angles, and its corners aligned in a perfect equilateral formation. More astonishing was its scale, over 90 meters on each side. Divers who approached it found that its surface wasn't smooth rock but a mosaic of smaller polygonal tiles. These weren't natural formations. They interlocked with such precision that even millimeter-thin cracks were absent. If the structure were above water, it would resemble the foundation of a grand ceremonial platform or the base of a colossal monument. Yet no civilization ever recorded such a thing. No empire, no tribe, no ancient seafaring culture of the Atlantic left any reference to a structure of this magnitude. Unless, of course, the civilization that built it vanished long before writing began. More clues surfaced when divers discovered a series of large pillar-like stones arranged in a circle, each one toppled, each one scarred with the marks of intense heat. Volcanic activity could explain that, but not the patterning. The stones weren't random. They formed a ring with an inner diameter matching megalithic sites found in Brittany and the British Isles. The Azores were hundreds of miles away from those places, yet the architectural fingerprints were undeniably similar. The idea that these pillars once stood above water seemed outrageous at first. But when geologists analyzed their erosion patterns, they discovered something startling. The weathering on the stones didn't match underwater erosion alone. Some marks were consistent with exposure to wind and rain, centuries worth, before the ocean eventually consumed them. That single detail rewrote the entire mystery. The terraces, trench, triangular platform, and stone circle may have once belonged to a sprawling coastal complex, one that existed when sea levels were dramatically lower, long before the end of the last ice age. That pushed the timeline back not hundreds, but thousands of years before the construction of the pyramids of Egypt. But perhaps the most haunting discovery came from inside a narrow underwater cavern. Divers entered through a slit barely wide enough for a human body, descending 40 meters into darkness until their lights illuminated a smooth chamber. Its walls weren't natural. They bore long, parallel grooves, tool marks, not metal tools but something harder, sharper, capable of cutting basalt as though it were soft clay. At the chamber's center lay a flat slab, perfectly rectangular, as though crafted for ritual or storage. On the slab sat a single stone cube, its faces etched with patterns that no one had yet deciphered. The symbols were geometric but also fluid, as if combining mathematics with something more symbolic, something like writing. The cube became known as the Azores stone, and although its markings remained mysterious, its very existence deepened an already unsettling question. If a civilization capable of such engineering once lived here, what happened to it? Volcanic activity could have wiped it out. Rising sea levels could have drowned its cities. Or perhaps it wasn't destroyed at all. Perhaps it simply fled, sailing east or west in search of safer shores. And if it sailed, it may have carried knowledge across the world long before recognized history began. Knowledge that could have survived in fragments, in myths, in oral traditions, in symbols, and perhaps even in the secret archives of later groups. Knowledge that the Knights Templar, with their obsession for ancient wisdom and their reach across 3 continents, might have rediscovered thousands of years later. If these submerged structures truly hinted at a forgotten civilization, then the possibility that the Templars encountered remnants of it and attempted to preserve them no longer felt like fantasy. It began to feel like a missing chapter of history finally resurfacing from the ocean floor. And as more evidence emerged, the connection between lost maritime empires and the legendary Templar fleet would only grow stronger, unraveling a story that bridged continents, centuries, and the deepest mysteries of human memory. When news of the submerged Azores structures reached certain academic circles, most scholars dismissed it as exaggerated speculation. But within private networks, quiet email chains, encrypted forums, and old letter correspondences between researchers who kept their most controversial theories off the public record. Another idea began to surface. The possibility that the Knights Templar may have known about these Atlantic anomalies long before modern science rediscovered them. It seemed absurd on the surface. The Templars were medieval warriors and bankers, not oceanographers or deep-sea explorers. But the order had something else that most institutions lacked: access to ancient documents, relics, and fragments of forgotten lore collected from Crusader conquests, Eastern monasteries, desert nomads, and mysterious sects that had preserved knowledge long erased elsewhere. Some of these texts reportedly described lands beyond the setting sun, written centuries before Europeans believed in anything beyond the known coasts. A few even referenced islands of the drowned kings, a phrase that scholars typically interpreted as poetic myth. But what if these weren't metaphors? What if they were half-remembered accounts of civilizations that once thrived along the Atlantic, later swallowed by rising waters? Hidden among these documents were maps, partial, faded, coded maps, whose coastlines didn't match any known geography. Historians assumed they were fanciful inventions created by imaginative scribes. But to those who studied them carefully, patterns emerged. A few of the coastlines resembled the outlines of now-submerged Atlantic ridges. One map in particular showed a chain of islands stretching across the ocean between Europe and the Americas, positioned uncannily close to the Azores archipelago as it once looked during the Ice Age, when sea levels were far lower. Of course, no one dared present these ideas formally. Careers were built on safer ground. Yet a handful of researchers couldn't shake the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, the Templars possessed knowledge inherited from someone far older than themselves. The turning point came when a historian named Lucien Morel stumbled across an unusual reference in a Templar inventory list recovered from the archives of Aragon. The list mentioned a crate labeled only as Origo Maris, the origin of the sea. Unlike other crates, which contained predictable items like coins, relics, or manuscripts, this one had no description of its contents. It was listed under the possessions of the Templar fleet's Western Command, the same fleet that vanished on the night the order was destroyed. Morel dug deeper and found another document, this one a letter from a Templar captain to his commander, written just months before the arrests. It spoke cryptically of the stones that sing in the deep and the old channels carved long before the flood. The captain warned that the knowledge they had uncovered was too ancient, too powerful, and too dangerous to be left in the hands of kings who fear what they cannot control. What stones? What channels? No medieval sailor had the ability to view the ocean floor. Unless, of course, they weren't describing discoveries they had made, but discoveries someone had told them about. It was then that Morel encountered an obscure legend whispered among fishermen in the Azores themselves. The story claimed that long ago, before the islands were fully settled, strange ships bearing red crosses visited the shores during a storm. The sailors were not local Portuguese or explorers of the era. They were described as tall, hooded, and bearing symbols unknown to the villagers at the time. They came ashore only at night, exchanged goods with local priests who kept the encounters secret, and returned to their ships before dawn. The islanders said these men spoke of guardianship, old pathways, and a house beneath the waves. Could this have been the Templars? The timing was uncertain, but the symbolism was unmistakable. And what business would a medieval military order have on an isolated Atlantic archipelago, unless they were pursuing something specific? Some believe that after the fall of the order, surviving Templars sailed west, taking with them not only their treasure but their most closely guarded knowledge. If they possessed records pointing toward a lost Atlantic civilization, they would have had every reason to sail into the ocean that guarded its ruins. The Azores were an ideal stopping point, remote, unmonitored, and strategically placed between Europe and the unknown worlds beyond. Then came the most startling revelation. A diver exploring a submerged cave system near Terceira Island found an inscribed stone slab half-buried under coral. The slab featured a symbol unmistakably similar to a Templar cross, but altered. Its arms were elongated, and at their tips were small triangles pointing outward, forming a compass-like pattern. Around the cross were concentric circles etched in patterns resembling ancient Atlantean symbolism described by Plato, circles of land and sea. But here they were arranged not horizontally, but vertically, stacked downward like a series of descending levels, eerily similar to the underwater terraces discovered earlier. Scholars were quick to dismiss the slab as a modern forgery. Yet the coral growth dates suggested it was submerged centuries ago, long before modern hands could have carved it. The implications were staggering. If the slab was authentic, it meant someone familiar with both Templar iconography and ancient Atlantic symbolism had carved it, and that someone had left it as a marker, a guide, or perhaps a warning. What made the slab even more enigmatic was an inscription along its lower edge. The language was unrecognizable. Not Latin, not Greek, not any medieval script. But one symbol appeared repeatedly, 3 stacked lines descending into a semicircle, almost like the abstract representation of a sun sinking beneath the ocean. Morel believed it was a reference to a drowned archive, a sunken repository of knowledge preserved by a civilization that existed before recorded history, and that the Templars had attempted to locate, study, or protect it. The more he uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. The Templars weren't simply a military order or a religious institution. They were collectors, preservers, and sometimes guardians of ancient knowledge, some of which may have predated their own faith by millennia. But why would they search the Atlantic? Why chase legends of lost civilizations when their power was already immense? The answer, Morel concluded, lay not in glory or conquest, but in fear. A fear that something buried in the deep, something humanity once knew but had forgotten, was too dangerous to remain hidden, or too dangerous to be uncovered by the wrong hands. And if the Templars truly believed such knowledge existed, then their vanished fleet was not simply escaping persecution. It was fulfilling a mission that began centuries earlier, in the ruins of ancient worlds whose memory had almost been erased. Almost. By the time Lucien Morel pieced together the scattered clues pointing toward a Templar presence in the Atlantic, another field of study began quietly converging with his own: marine geology. Not the mainstream research focused on tectonic plates and volcanic activity, but a fringe within the discipline, scientists who believed that some oceanic anomalies could only be explained by human intervention in a prehistoric era. The Azores Plateau, a massive uplift beneath the islands, was long seen as a geological curiosity. But as sonar technology advanced, researchers noticed patterns in the seabed that didn't conform to typical volcanic formations. Straight lines where chaos should have been. Rectangles hidden beneath millennia of sediment. Perfect circles etched into the basalt floor with diameters too consistent to be random. One scan revealed something even stranger. A massive depression shaped as though an enormous stone structure had once stood there, only to collapse or be removed. The imprint was too symmetrical, too sharply defined. It looked almost like the foundation of a great vaulted hall, one long lost beneath layers of ash and water. As geological theories grew bolder, Morel realized he was no longer alone in speculating about ancient civilizations in the Atlantic. But while scientists sought natural explanations, he searched for human fingerprints, for signs that someone, at some point in history, had sought out these ruins intentionally. The breakthrough came not from the sea, but from an unassuming monastery in northern Portugal. An archivist contacted Morel after reading one of his obscure papers. He claimed to possess several pages from a damaged maritime journal believed to have been written in the early 14th century. The manuscript was fragile, barely legible, and clearly incomplete, but its contents were unlike anything Morel had seen. The journal's author described a voyage undertaken under the banner of the Red Cross, though not with the blessing of Rome. The crew consisted of brothers loyal to the great work, men who sailed westward into waters where the stars themselves seemed to shift. The journal recounted storms, strange lights in the deep, and an island crowned with black cliffs and whispering stone. The most intriguing passage detailed an encounter with an underwater pavement, a smooth platform visible through unusually clear water on a calm day. The writer described seeing squares and rectangles arranged like the flooring of a great church, but made by hands far older. He wrote of the sensation that the stones were humming, vibrating faintly beneath the waves. Even more startling was a brief mention of a vault, a word heavily underlined, followed by a cryptic remark: "The vault is sealed, the old knowledge sleeps, We must ensure it remains so until the appointed time. Morel felt a chill when he read that. The phrasing mirrored fragments from other Templar documents referring to a great work, a mission beyond crusades or treasure, something tied to ancient knowledge, preservation, and secrecy. But the journal contained another twist. The writer mentioned that they carried with them an object retrieved from the ruins of the Eastern Temple, likely referring to Jerusalem. He claimed it was a key, not a literal key, but something symbolic, something that aligns with the chambers of the deep and awakens the memory locked in stone. He hinted that this object allowed them to recognize patterns in the submerged structures, patterns invisible to ordinary sailors. The pages deteriorated shortly after this passage, breaking off before the mission's outcome was revealed. Morel searched desperately for the missing sections, but they were long gone, lost to mold, fire, or centuries of mishandling. Still, the journal validated something profound. The Templars were not simply hiding from persecution when they vanished. They were on a deliberate, coordinated mission toward something ancient and deep beneath the ocean. Around this same time, another piece of the puzzle emerged, this one from a completely different realm. A team of oceanographers studying magnetic anomalies near the Azores discovered a peculiar pattern on their instruments. Periodic fluctuations centered around a specific underwater ridge. The readings suggested that the area contained a massive deposit of metallic material, far more than ordinary volcanic rock could account for. But the anomaly's shape was the real mystery. It wasn't a random cluster. It formed a ring, a perfectly circular ring, several hundred meters in diameter. No natural formation matched it. The scientists kept the discovery quiet, sharing it only with a small network of colleagues. But when the data leaked to a private historical think tank in France, Morel was asked to review it. The moment he saw the ring-shaped anomaly, his pulse quickened. It mirrored ancient descriptions of Atlantean architecture, circular rings of metal and stone, arranged concentrically. But there was something else, something unmistakably modern in its implications. Metal on that scale could only come from deliberate construction. The team speculated that it might be the remains of an enormous ancient structure, possibly a wall, a foundation, or something unknown that defied categorization. Morel proposed a more daring hypothesis. What if the metallic ring wasn't the structure itself, but what was left of a protective barrier? One designed to shield something inside. Something like a vault. He remembered the journal's reference. The vault is sealed. His heart raced at the possibility. If the ring truly was an ancient sealing mechanism, it meant the structure beneath it was not merely architectural, it was technological, at least in the sense of advanced engineering far beyond what history acknowledged. This changed everything. Morel began comparing the sonar data to ancient accounts of lost civilizations. He found uncanny correlations. Legends from West Africa spoke of cities beneath the ocean that glowed like gold. Celtic myths described rings of shining metal in the Western Sea. Even early Arabic texts mentioned travelers seeing circles of silver in the deep, near the islands in the far ocean. But the most chilling connection came from a Templar document known as the Codex Arcanum, a cryptic text most historians dismissed as allegory. One passage spoke of the Circle of the First Memory, a ring of metal that guarded the archive of those who ruled before the flood. This was no coincidence. The Templars believed that an ancient archive, containing records, artifacts, or knowledge, lay hidden beneath the Atlantic. And the more Morel connected the dots, the clearer it became that the Order's vanished fleet had been searching for it. Or perhaps they found it. Or perhaps they were guarding it. The question was no longer whether the Templars knew about ancient Atlantic ruins. It was what they believed was inside the vault beneath the sea, and why they went to such lengths to keep it hidden. But the most extraordinary revelation still lay ahead, waiting to link the Templar mission, the sunken structures, and the strange metallic ring into a single, breathtaking possibility. One that would challenge the very foundation of historical memory. The evening before Lucien Morel was scheduled to present his findings to a small academic forum in Lisbon, he received a message that changed everything. It was a short, anonymous email containing a single line of text. "You are looking in the wrong century." Attached was an encrypted file labeled simply Trinacria, Morel hesitated before opening it. The symbol of the Trinacria, a three-legged emblem, had deep roots in Mediterranean mythology. In Sicily, it represented the island itself. In older traditions, it symbolized motion, cycles, and power radiating from a hidden center. But here, inside a file linked to Templar research, that made no sense. The file, once opened, contained grainy photographs of a centuries-old wooden chest recovered from a collapsed chamber beneath a fortified manor in eastern Sicily. The images showed carvings on the chest's lid, an ornate Templar cross encircled by three spiraling legs, identical to the Trinacria. Beneath the emblem were three Latin words: iter, orbis, fons. The path, the circle, the source. Morel's breath caught. It was the same triad that appeared in certain rare Templar manuscripts, usually in reference to their great work, a mission that predated the Crusades and had nothing to do with Jerusalem or the Holy Land. According to those fragments, the path referred to a journey across the sea, the circle to a ring-shaped structure, and the source to an ancient power or archive that once sustained a civilization lost to time. Inside the chest, the photos revealed a tightly rolled scroll, blackened at the edges by fire. The ink was faded, but parts of it remained legible. It described a voyage undertaken not in the 14th century, but far earlier, toward the end of the 12th century, during the height of the Templars' influence. The text spoke of a Council of Seven, an elite group within the order tasked with safeguarding the ancient covenant of guardianship. This idea unsettled Morel. It implied that the Templars hadn't discovered a secret late in their existence. They were founded, at least in part, to protect something ancient, something located nowhere near Jerusalem. The scroll mentioned a journey beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, following the instructions of the Elder Map. The Elder Map was a mysterious object referenced only in passing in Templar lore, often thought to be myth. But here, it was described in detail. A circular parchment divided into sectors, showing coastlines that did not match known medieval geography. The map was reportedly created long before Rome, long before Greece, dating back to a civilization that fell into the embrace of the sea. If the Elder Map truly existed, it was the Templars' most sacred artifact, not because it pointed to treasure, but because it pointed to memory, humanity's earliest memory. The scroll then described a departure. 7 ships leaving a secluded cove in Sicily at midnight, sails blackened to blend with the sea. Their goal was to reach the place where the sea hides its throne. A poetic phrase, but one that Morel now believed referred to the metallic ring hidden beneath the Atlantic. The scroll broke off abruptly, its final lines too damaged to read. But the chest contained something else. A triangular metal plate, about the size of a hand, etched with geometric patterns. The symbols resembled those carved into the stone cube discovered by divers in the Azores cave. Morel felt a jolt of recognition. The same shapes, the same arcs, the same concentric circles. This triangular plate, this relic, could not be dismissed as coincidence. It meant the Templars had physically possessed an artifact connected to the submerged structures. And the fact that it was found in Sicily, not France or Portugal, suggested something even more profound. The Templars may have had a Mediterranean staging ground for voyages into the Atlantic. Sicily, with its ancient Greek, Phoenician, and Arabic roots, was a crossroads of lost knowledge. If any place in Europe preserved memories of an Atlantic civilization, it would be here. As Morel dug deeper, he discovered another clue. A 12th century Arabic text, written by a scholar in Palermo, mentioned Franks who sought the drowned kingdoms. The writer claimed these men, whom he described as warriors clothed as monks, consulted local astronomers about star paths leading west. The astronomers advised them that beyond the setting sun lay a chain of islands once inhabited by a people older than the pyramids. The text also claimed that these monks carried with them a triangular starstone, an artifact the scholar believed came from a fallen empire. When Morel read this, he realized he was looking at the same object found in the chest centuries later. The Templars weren't guessing where to look. They weren't following mere legends. They had a guide, an artifact, a map, and perhaps even knowledge passed down through traditions older than any European kingdom. One evening, after days of obsessive research, Morel spread out all his notes on the floor of his apartment. As he connected the fragments, photographs, transcripts, sonar maps, legends, journal entries, he noticed a pattern he had missed before. The elder map's divisions, as described in the scroll, formed a triskelion, 3 spiraling arms radiating from a central point. It wasn't merely a symbol. It was a directional code. Each spiral pointed toward a region of the Atlantic: the north, the west, and the south. The Templars were not searching a single location. They were tracing 3 converging paths, routes leading to a central point encoded in the map. A point that modern geology now knew was the Azores Plateau. The realization unsettled Morel in a way he couldn't explain. If the elder map spirals were directional markers, then the Templars had deciphered the same geometric grid that modern sonar only recently revealed. Patterns etched into the seabed itself. Patterns that could only have been created by a civilization capable of planning on a massive scale. A civilization that understood mathematics, astronomy, and geospatial design far better than anyone in the medieval world. And the Templars had known about it. But the most chilling detail came last. Inside the encrypted file marked Trinacria, one final document lay buried beneath the photographs. It was a single sentence, written in modern English, stamped with a digital watermark belonging to an unidentified research organization. It read, "The vault has never been opened. The key is still missing." Morel stared at the words for a long time, feeling something cold crawl up his spine. If the key was missing, then someone, somewhere, still believed the vault existed. And if the Templars once carried the key, an artifact now lost to time, then the mystery wasn't buried in the 14th century. It was still alive. The last puzzle piece fell into place as Morel examined the ancient manuscript he'd found buried in a Templar library in France. It was hidden among texts long thought to be irrelevant, but this one stood out. The symbols matched perfectly with the sonar images from the deep. The Templars, it seemed, had encoded a map leading to the vault, not with straightforward instructions, but with riddles and complex celestial alignments. The vault was not just a place, but a living repository, a gateway to knowledge that could reshape everything humanity knew about its origins. As Morel traced the final set of symbols, his pulse quickened. He was not just looking at ancient history, he was staring at the key to humanity's future. The moment he'd been waiting for had arrived, but with it, a deep unease settled in. What was the cost of unlocking these secrets? He shuddered, realizing the responsibility that now lay on his shoulders. The descent into the abyss was quieter than Morel had imagined, but the tension was suffocating. As the submersible lowered deeper into the ocean, the temperature dropped, and the water grew darker. The sonar scans confirmed that the vault was not far beneath them. The walls of the ancient structure began to materialize in the murk, massive and covered in symbols. Each symbol was more elaborate than the last, but it wasn't until they reached the central chamber that Morel felt his breath catch. The opening was massive, a doorway carved into the stone like a portal, its entrance framed by mysterious, otherworldly runes. The architecture felt ancient, untouched by time. But what lay inside? Morel's heart raced as they moved closer. This wasn't just history, it was an invitation. The moment the ROV touched the vault's central disk, the atmosphere shifted. The ocean, usually still and silent, seemed to come alive. The stone walls of the chamber emitted a strange vibration. Morel's breath caught as the camera feed flickered, the screen now showing a faint glow coming from the disk. It was as though the vault was responding, awakening from a centuries-long slumber. The symbols on the walls shifted, subtly changing, as though the structure itself had been waiting for this moment. The crew's panic grew as the technology began to malfunction. Was this the final test? Morel was torn between awe and fear. Had they triggered something they weren't prepared for? The vault's secrets might be even more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. As the ship moved away from the site, Morel stood alone on the deck, staring out at the blackened sea. The vault, for now, was lost to the depths again. The object, the key, had it unleashed something? The ROV had confirmed it. The vault had reacted, its ancient mechanisms activated. But to what end? Morel couldn't shake the feeling that their discovery had only scratched the surface of a far greater mystery, something that could change the course of history. The Templars had hidden it, the ocean had protected it, and now they had unlocked it. But what lay inside was still unknown. Could the world handle it? Morel closed his eyes, knowing that the real journey had just begun. What they had uncovered was only the beginning of a far deeper, more dangerous game. The vault's secrets might just change everything. Forever.